Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone for day 2 of this workshop. Just a quick summary. Yesterday in session 1, we reviewed clinical applications of therapy and diagnostic imaging, had some very interesting discussions and insights into therapy and other clinical applications. In session 2, we took a closer look at quantitative imaging using SPECT and how it's developed over the past years, and looked to future possibilities for instrumentation. So today we kind of go to the next important point, and that is we will look at isotope production. We can't do any of this without the isotopes that are furnished to us, and look at the dosimetry and the role that it plays in cancer therapy. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jehanne Gillo from the Department of Energy, and she will be presenting on DOE's network of isotope supply and production plans. Dr. Gillo, please.
Hello, my name is Jehanne Gillo, and I'm the director of the DOE Isotope Program. I'm also director of the Facilities and Project Management Division in the Office of Nuclear Physics at the Office of Science. So the Isotope Program is it's a very unique program within the department, and its mission is essentially fourfold. We produce or extract or enrich isotopes that are in short supply only. We do not compete with small businesses or commercial products that are out there. So we fill gaps, both in radioactive and stable isotopes. We maintain the infrastructure at universities and at national laboratories that are required to provide the isotopes to the nation. We have a very rigorous R&D effort on isotope production and chemical processing, as well as workforce development. We are not users of isotopes, but producers of isotopes. And something that we've really been paying a lot of attention to recently is, over the past many years, is the robustness of domestic supply chains. We are really aiming to reduce dependency on foreign supply. So this is a portfolio of the program, and as you see, we are really scattered across the United States. The boxes that are in yellow are those that are official partners or production sites within the program. Those that are in green are those that are in the process of becoming production sites in the program, and the gray are sites that are owned by NNSA, but where we do work to extract or process isotopes for the program. Now, I'll spend a little bit of time here describing the various facilities. We have a number of accelerator facilities in which we use to produce isotopes. We have 2 proton accelerators, one at Brookhaven National Laboratory and the other one at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And you see in the boxes some of the sample isotopes that we produce there, a lot of medical isotopes. Also at Los Alamos, we have the plutonium facility, it's NNSA owned, that's the National Security Administration. That's where we do extraction of americium-241 out of the plutonium waste stream, provide for oil and gas exploration and power sources. We have also an electron accelerator at Paragon National Laboratory. They've recently entered the market for the provision of copper-67 for cancer therapy. And we have some university accelerator facilities at the University of Washington, the University of Alabama, Birmingham. We have 3 reactors that we utilize: the high flux isotope reactor at Oak Ridge National Lab, the advanced test reactor at Idaho National Laboratory, and also the research reactor at the University of Missouri. broad portfolios of isotopes that we provide from the reactors. At the Savannah River National Laboratory Tritium Facility, we extract helium-3 from the NNSA-owned tritium beds. And we manage the nation's inventory for helium-3, which is used for a suite of applications. And at the Y12 facility near Oak Ridge National Lab, we process lithium-6 and lithium-7, primarily for neutron detection and also radiation dosimeters. We restarted enriched stable isotope production in 2017 in the nation. This is really a capability that had been stopped in the past decades. Used to be something that we practiced quite strongly at Oak Ridge with the operation of what was called the calutrons. Those were a product of the Manhattan Project, and there was a large inventory, over 200 isotopes that had been enriched that we manage out of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. But those inventories have been dwindling. And as you know, they're used for all sorts of applications, including feedstock materials for radioisotope production. Radioisotopes important for medical applications. So we've restarted with the development of gas centrifuge technology and also electromagnetic ion separation technology. We've started that up again to provide the nation with those capabilities. So some of you may have heard of the National Isotope Development Center. This is the business arm of the isotope program, where you go to actually produce the isotope, to purchase the isotopes that we produce. You see that the website there that's noted is www.isotopes.gov. And if you go there, you'll see on the main page, the little green rectangle that I have circled in red. You can sign up to be part of our distribution list. And we'll let you know when we develop a new isotope and make it available for purchase or research applications. We have a very rigorous isotope R&D program, and we're involved in a lot of Office of Science initiatives, such as advanced manufacturing, quantum information science, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. We put out a biannual funding opportunity announcement to support isotope production R&D. So if there is an isotope that you want for medical applications that nobody knows how to produce or that is not yet available, don't be shy in letting us know that this is something that you're interested in, because we have appropriated funds to invest to figure out how to make that isotope. And as you've seen, we have a lot of capabilities that we can use in order to be able to produce them. We consider ourselves the world leaders in producing alpha emitters. All of you know alpha emitters have been really the subject of a lot of interest recently, and I think we've really strongly been promoting the availability of alpha emitters within the medical community, beta emitters as well, but targeted alpha therapy has really shown a stunning success and a lot of promise towards treating metastasized cancers. And we want to do our part in making sure that those isotopes are available for preclinical and clinical trials. The first alpha emitter that was approved by the FDA was the Xofigo drug. And this is, of course, made available by Bayer. We're the ones who produce the actinium-227 for Bayer. We're the only worldwide producer of actinium-227. We have been making investments at Oak Ridge National Lab, where we produce it, to make sure that we can keep up with demand. we have interest in a large number of alpha emitters, and this table shows those that we have been really investing a lot of time and effort into figuring out how to produce them and make them available for you. And you see that their half-lives are all different. Some of them they're fairly short, and they present a challenge for us, but that's one of the reasons that we all also make investments at the university facilities so that they can hopefully produce regional, make available those isotopes regionally. Actinium-225 takes up a lot of our focus right now. We do have a thorium cal that we use to provide actinium-225, and it is completely oversubscribed. We knew it would be completely oversubscribed. We have developed accelerator product with the use of our 2 proton accelerators. We are in routine production of that actinium-225, and we are, in addition, pursuing other production routes that you see at the bottom of the screen: small cyclotron production, phototransmutation, and reactor production as well. We have submitted drug master files for both the thorium product and the proton accelerator product. A neat breakthrough that came that we made just in this past year was being able to demonstrate the ability to produce and purify cerium-134. And that was really exciting because it decayed into lanthanum-134, which is, shown its usefulness in PET imaging. And it looks like this might be a very nice diagnostic partner for medical treatments that use either actinium-225 or thorium-227. We're making that available to the community this summer as test batches. So we're really excited. I won't go through all of these, but it's just to show you these are the more common medical isotopes that we produce that are routinely available. Remember, we're only trying to produce those that nobody else knows how to produce or that are in short supply. So it's a nice list of isotopes, and being able to enable applications with these medical isotopes. We've been given encouragement from Congress to work more closely with NIH. The NIH appropriation, they were also encouraged to do so. We've have taken a couple steps to make our relationship with NIH a little bit stronger. One in particular is a new funding opportunity announcement, which you saw was released earlier in the summer, called Accelerating Medical Isotopes. It's really at the interface of the 2 agencies. And the focus was to try to do those initial tests, that initial research, to more readily prepare these new isotopes that we were making available for clinical and preclinical trials. And we've also started an isotope traineeship this summer. We put out our first funding opportunity announcement to apply advanced manufacturing techniques to isotope production. And I'd also want to show you those isotopes that are under development. This is a list of those that you should be expecting to see in the near term that we want to bring to the medical community. Those that you'll see the most quickly, I think, are cerium-134 that I was telling you about, where we're doing test batches in July, as well as the tellurium-119M and the titanium-44, scandium-44. So we're positioning ourselves to go into routine production on those isotopes in the very near future. So as you see here, a lot of new isotopes that are being made available for diagnostic applications. And we hope that these will be interesting to this community as you're moving forward and developing new paths forward for diagnostic applications. And you should let us know if there are any other isotopes that you're interested in that are not on this list. So in summary, we're a small, unique program in the department, given that we actually sell products, but we also do a lot of research, and we have a lot of capability that we can exploit in the university setting as well as the federal complex, and we try to use those to the advantage of the nation. We're here to provide a service. So we have a lot of core competencies in novel isotope production, and we're proud to bring rare and critical isotopes to the global community. So we look for ways to be more strongly integrated with the medical community, and we welcome your input in terms of what else you might need in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for explaining where all of the radioisotopes come from and how we can get more as we need newer ones going forward. We're waiting to see if some questions come in. However, we've noticed yesterday that sometimes it takes the attendees a while to formulate a question and type it in. So since I see none, and also our next speaker will not be available to answer questions since Dr. Van Nostrand is not attending, we will keep all the questions for the end panel discussion, and any that are pointed towards you or your talk, we will bring them up then and go through them sequentially. So to the attendees, oh, okay, we have a question. Could you say something about the facilities at PNNL and how easy it is to collaborate? A very nice question.
Well, we do have an isotope program footprint at PNNL, and we have a very easy time collaborating with them. Their facilities are heavily oversubscribed, however, and so it's, I would say that collaboration requires, or access to their chemical processing facilities requires a lot of advance notice, but other than that, we've had a lot of success in working with them. I don't know if there's a more specific question that I can respond to, but in general, collaboration is very easy for us.
Thank you. I thought I saw a question flash up from one of the speakers. If there are speakers from yesterday or today that have a question, you can turn on your video and audio, and we'll take your question and get an immediate answer. If not, then perhaps we could get a little bit ahead of schedule. Oh, actually, we are right on schedule. So, Joanne, thank you very much. Hopefully there'll be more questions when we get to the panel discussion. And I will move on to Dr. Doug Van Nostrand's talk. As mentioned, he did pre-record his talk, but not available, unfortunately, to answer questions live. But I believe if you have questions regarding his presentation, please do type them in. I'm sure we can find someone amongst the panel and speakers that could answer or add some insights to any questions. So Dr. Van Nostrand's presentation on radioiodine, a paragon of theranostics.
Good morning. I'm Doug Van Nostrand, and I'd like to thank Dr. Zubel for inviting me to speak to you today. And over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about radioiodine, a paragon for theranostics. But it is much more than just a paragon for theranostics, which I'll talk about more in a minute. After attending this presentation, you will be able to list two qualities that make radioiodine a paragon of theranostics, and will describe three additional qualities of radioiodine, which again makes it much more than just a paragon of theranostics. You just quickly saw my financial disclosures and a word about theranostics, or is it theragnostics or thera-gnostics or theraponostics? And here are some definitions which I will not go through in detail. This audience understands the phrase, but it involves radioactive drugs or isotopes in the diagnosis and using those for therapy. Now, for those who are interested in etymology, here are references which I'll not go through, but they're very fascinating if you like the study of words and where they came from. But I would like to do a quick report of the number of citations that I found on Google Scholar for each of the proposed terms. So for theraponostics, there were 3 references that Google Scholar cited. For thera-gnostics, there were 4. And for theragnostics with a G in it, there were 3,400. And for theranostics, there was 115,000. Now, one of my favorite books is by Fowler about modern usage of the English language. And one of the comments that he has made is that frequently what determines what word is used is just frequency. So based upon this frequency, I will use the word theranostics and leave the etymology to those who are interested. Now, what makes radioiodine a paragon of theranostics? Well, of course, it's, as I already pointed out, it's the diagnosis and it's the therapy. But there is so much more, and those other 3 areas are what I'm going to spend most of my time on. Now, in regard to diagnosis, we use I-123 and I-131, as everyone knows, as the workhorse for our radioiodine imaging of differentiated thyroid cancer. And I've just included some scans here to demonstrate. The first scan, and in fact, demonstrates multiple focal areas in the thyroid bed, indicative of metastatic disease in the lymph nodes. This third image was performed in a patient with a near total thyroidectomy, and this patient still needs a near total thyroidectomy. And of course, this patient has multiple metastases in the thyroid bed and in the lung, and this patient has one in the right humerus. So that's the key working horses, but the real exciting area in radioiodine is I-124, and this is a planar image of a patient with maybe 10 to 15 bone metastasis from our clinic, and this is a I-124 scan that was performed in the same patient and demonstrates the superior resolution in contrast of a PET scan. And one may argue, well, if I see 26 lesions instead of just 15, how does that alter my management? Well, not in this particular case, but the fact is this case really demonstrates how powerful I-124 PET imaging is over regular planar I-131 or I-123, so that it detects disease earlier, and in those scans that are negative with I-131 or I-123, I-124 will do a much better job, and that's been well demonstrated in the literature by multiple institutions and prospective studies. Now, trying to give you a sense of I-131 therapy, and please don't do the right image. Hopefully you are using a cup and the capsule's in the cup and the patient takes it out of the capsule. But how do I try to visually show you the value and the success of I-131 therapy, the second half of the paragon of theranostics? So I thought I'd show you one of my earlier patients. And this is then a picture of him prior to I-131, and here he is after the I-131 therapy. So I-131 therapy really can be quite effective. Now, but it's so much more. And what is the so much more aspect? It's determining the maximum allowable administered therapeutic activity to minimize side effects or unacceptable side effects. And that, of course, is dosimetry. And the critical organ typically with I-131 is bone marrow, but there are also other organs such as salivary gland, liver, kidney, etc. And I'll only briefly talk about that. And I'm not going to go through all the issues of dosimetry. Many of those who are speaking and many in the audience are much more knowledgeable about some of the physics of this than I am. But I want to emphasize that for the bone marrow, it's really critical that we do look at how much rad, how many gray are being delivered to the patient for an I-131 therapy. And it's quite variable. We actually looked at this back in 2000 over a 4-year period, approximately a 4-year period of over 100 patients that had dosimetry performed with Merrily approach, and to calculate the maximum tolerated activity that is allowable not to deliver more than 200 rads. And it's a wide spectrum, all the way from 100, 150, all the way up to greater than 800 millicuries. And the real issue here is that if we use just an empiric dose of 100, 1% of the patients may exceed 200 rads, which is not too bad. But then have we undertreated that patient and we haven't delivered enough rads or grays to the cancer to get a good outcome? If an empiric dose is administered 200, then 14% would have exceeded 200 rads to the bone marrow, which is now of concern. And if Menzel early on was administering 300 millicuries empirically, 22% would have received more than 200 rads to the bone marrow. So it's important that dosimetry for the critical organ of bone marrow is considered and is really the third quality of radioiodine for a Paragon of Theranostics. Now, in regard to liver, lung, and kidney, this is a very busy slide, and I won't go through it in detail, but just to emphasize that we are already doing grays and rads to lungs, heart, liver, kidneys, and this was actually a study in which the patient was given thyrogen and then prepared with thyrogen and then was prepared with thyroid hormone withdrawal, all in the same patient, and we compared the grays delivered. So dosimetry is critical. Now, the fourth quality that is so much more than just diagnosis and therapy is determining the minimal administered activity to achieve the desired therapeutic outcome. And with I-131, the Sentinel article was really Harry Maxim back in 1983. And in his New England Journal of Medicine article, he showed that you needed to deliver at least 30,000 rad to the thyroid remnant to get a successful outcome. And for metastatic disease, you needed to deliver greater than 8,000 rads. Now keep that 8,000 rads in mind regarding lesional dosimetry. With I-124, Dr. Senthamil and Plyku from our lab, as well as John Hopkins and George Sgouros and Rob Hobbs, we looked at these lesions with I-124. And if the patient received less than, interestingly enough, 8,000 rads to the lesion that was progressing before continued to progress. But if we delivered more than 8,000 rads, those progressive lesions either became stable, had a partial remission, or complete remission. So I-124 really demonstrates superior value with lesional dosimetry, and of course demonstrates this fourth quality of why radioiodine is a paragon of theranostics. Now with I-123, there's less data on that, but there's an interesting study coming out from Brown and Flux and Wesley in Europe, where they're going to use I-123 to predict response to I-131, and we await their results. Now, the last quality is assessing these altered genomic cancer cells' molecular biology in order to modify it and permit I-131 therapy in a patient when the scan was negative. And this is a study from Alan Ho from Memorial Sloan Kettering and Jim Fagan, published in New England Journal of Medicine. And this is an I-124 PET scan. And there is no If you see my arrow, there is no evidence of metastatic disease. All of the activity you see is physiological. Patient was treated with a MEK inhibitor. Patient has BRAF positive, and it turns off the sodium iodine symporter. The MEK turns off that inhibition of that cancer cell on the sodium iodine symporter. And after treatment with selumetinib for 4 to 6 weeks, that inhibition of the sodium iodine symporter is removed, and the sodium iodine symporter is working again, and we have excellent uptake in multiple METs in both lungs and the mediastinum as well as the neck. And this is really exciting when, as an addition to diagnosis, therapy, we can now even look to see if we can alter that molecular biology of that cancer cell. Is this just research? Absolutely not, emphatically not. And in fact, Jaber from MD Anderson reported on 13 patients with I-131 scans performed clinically. They had originally negative scans, and this is their first patient, negative scan. They were placed on trametinib or dapirfenib either for clinical indications or a research study, either way, but they went on these 1 or 2 or combination of drugs, and then a clinical non-research scan was performed at 4 to 6 weeks, and in this patient, there's significant uptake in that right lung as well as the left lung, and this patient went on to be treated. We are doing these clinically now if the patient is already on trametinib or dapirfenib. Now, in regard to this redifferentiation, there's another quality of enhancement. And I distinguish these two, as I'll mention in a minute, for a very important reason. So this is patient 2 from Dr. Jaber's study, no uptake, received trametinib, dapirfenib, redifferentiation with marked pulmonary uptake, patient was treated. In this patient, there's actually some uptake here in the chest and also in the neck, and got trametinib, dapirfenib, or vemurafenib. I don't remember specifically which drug, and there's marked enhancement. Now, what's the difference? Oh, the mechanism is the same in both. This just didn't have enough inhibition of the sodium iodine symporter. There was still a little function, but this is a very important distinction to make. We would have treated this patient with radioiodine. Maybe we would have gotten some successful outcome, but if we actually treated them with trametinib and dapirfenib clinically, we would have enhanced the uptake here, and clearly, visually, this would have increased the likelihood of a more successful outcome for that patient. So enhancement, I think, is going to become a very important aspect of theranostics of radioiodine. Rothenberg's already published 6 cases here. This is a lot of information, but just glean it. All of these images on the left are pre-trametinib, dapirfenib, etc., pre-treatment. They all have a little uptake. After treatment, they have marked uptake. So enhancement, increasing uptake, increasing retention is going to be an important emphasis for future research. So in short, the diagnosis of the fact that radioiodine is a paragon of theranostics is because of diagnosis and therapy, but as already noted, it's much more. It's whole body dosimetry, it's lesional dosimetry, and now even assessing altered genomic cancer molecular biology and whether we can take off an inhibition of the sodium iodine symporter. And that can be in patients with negative or positive radioiodine scans. So let me thank Dr. Zubal again for his invitation. My staff past staff has really made all this work possible that we've done. My Gmail is noted below, and you are welcome to email me, and I'm happy to send you a slide set of this presentation. And this is actually my research team now, and we're all looking forward to a post-COVID party. Thank you very much.
So there are no questions. I don't see any questions right now, and we are right on time. So I think we'll go straight ahead to the next presentation. That next presentation will be by Dr. Wesley Block of University of Florida, and he will be talking about computational methods for estimating absorbed dose from images.
Good morning. My name is Wes Bolch. I'm at the University of Florida, and I want to thank Dr. George Zugel for this invitation to speak at this NIBIB-NCI workshop on emerging new instrumentation for imaging unsealed radionuclide therapy agents. My talk today is computational methods for estimating absorbed dose from images. I do not have any financial or other disclosures to announce. I would like to acknowledge that some of the material that I've derived from Chapter 9 of an upcoming ICRU Report 96, and I wanted to recognize my co-author who contributed to that chapter. So the methods of calculation of absorbed dose in nuclear medicine. So if we look at external beam radiotherapy, where we calculate absorbed dose to dosimetric treatment regions and regions at risk, they can often be measured or at least inferred from measurements, but tissue absorbed dose must be calculated in nuclear medicine. And there are three principal methods for doing this. Direct Monte Carlo radiation transport simulation, we'll say MC for short for Monte Carlo, dose point kernel convolution, DPK, and then the MERD schema S-value formalism. So these methods should not be viewed as independent. For example, S-value data must be determined by either Monte Carlo or DPK convolution, where DPK itself should be calculated either analytically or by Monte Carlo. DPK and MC approaches are used exclusively in external beam radiotherapy, but the S-value formalism is unique to nuclear medicine. So direct Monte Carlo is used exclusively at the subcellular level, a setting in which the other two methods are not really recommended. Owing to its high degree of accuracy, Monte Carlo simulations are generally considered to be the reference standard for tissue dosimetry and are the most reliable tool for computing radionuclide S values. DPK convolution is commonly used for dosimetry at the voxel level, which lies between the regimes of S values in direct Monte Carlo. Because of its moderate computational effort compared to Monte Carlo, it's a method of choice for 3D absorbed dose calculation of organs and tumors from emission computed tomography, such as SPECT and PET. DPK convolution has emerged as a preferred tool in personalized dosimetry in the clinical setting. However, DPK voxel-based dosimetry is often implemented clinically via voxel S values, and we'll briefly touch on that later in the talk. S values, the last one, are the most practical of the three methods owing to its link to the MERD schema. Although in principle it is applicable at any scale, the underlying approximations of the method, standardized anatomy, uniform source and target regions, it limits its use mostly to organs and suborgan levels. So let's start with Monte Carlo. The main advantages of Monte Carlo are its ability to handle inhomogeneous media, soft tissue lung interfaces, soft tissue bone interfaces, complex anatomical geometries, such as subregions of the brain, in conditions where radiation equilibrium is not fully fulfilled, such as near these interfaces. Monte Carlo simulations allow 3D dose distributions of any volume in the patient. An attractive feature of Monte Carlo lies in its applicability across a range of targets of interest, from centimeter scale to human organs to millimeter scale of imaging voxels, down to micron and nanometer scale for cells and cell compartments. Moreover, Monte Carlo simulations have the potential to link different stages of radiation interactions. You can have Monte Carlo simulations of radiation physics, radiation chemistry, radiation biology, ultimately leading to mechanistic bioeffect modeling of radiation interaction. There are some limitations, as there are in all these forms of dosimetry. Statistical limitations: there's only a finite number of particle histories that can be simulated as CPU time increases. Some of the solutions people have applied is moving from CPU to GPU computation, applying various reduction techniques, or even simplifying some of the physics to speed computation. Low energy particle cutoffs must be set to maintain reasonable CPU times. And then down at the microscopic level, there is the neglect of quantum mechanical uncertainties in the location of these radiation interactions. There are two broad methods of Monte Carlo. One is discrete interaction approach, the most sophisticated. Here, all interactions of the particle are simulated as discrete events in chronological order. The particle propagates in steps that represent the distance between successive interactions and the outcome of each step, whether it's a scattering or energy loss interaction. And that occurs through particular single scattering models. In a lot of cases, we do a condensed history approach, and the particle track is divided into steps sufficiently long compared to the mean free paths for elastic scattering, so that numerous interactions along the track are simulated in one step. Inelastic collisions are also condensed and are treated by concepts such as stocking power or straggling distributions. Some common Monte Carlo codes, one of the very first electron transport codes goes back to 1963 by Berger and Seltzer, ETRAN. But even today, that code is maintained, and it is the electron transport engine under the popular code MCMP. OPD and SCMS codes developed in the early to mid 2000s are treatment planning codes based on various forms of MCMP. Other widely used condensed history codes are Jehanne 4, EGS-NRC, Penelope, Fluka, and FITS. EGS4 is used in the treatment planning software Dose3D, and also the 3D-RD treatment planning code in nuclear medicine therapy. Jehanne 4 is the Monte Carlo image underlying gate for diagnostic and therapeutic nuclear medicine. It is also the Monte Carlo engine underlying Topaz, which was developed for charged particle therapies. And then finally, for advanced track structure, if you're looking at things down at the subcellular level, there's NOREC, supported by ORNL and NIST, PARTRAC from Munich, and Kubrick from Karolinska Institute. Some best practice, and this is coming from this chapter 9 of the ICRU report, at the human level, only photons need to be transported for large major organs such as alpha particles, betas, conversion electrons, and Auger electrons. Monte Carlo-based dosimetry of photons should rely on discrete simulation of photon interactions. At the voxel level, most beta particles are concerned for voxel self-dose, because alphas and Auger electrons can be treated as non-penetrating. At this scale, photons may contribute significantly to absorbed dose from crossfire. At this level, condensed history approach should generally be preferred for beta particles. At the cellular level, both alphas and betas are a concern because Augers can be mostly considered non-penetrating. Gamma rays provide negligible dose contribution, and condensed history approach may be sufficient for alphas and betas, but discrete simulations may offer some advantages for beta transport. And finally, at the subcellular level, all radiations are of concern, except for maybe gamma rays, and condensed history approach is not recommended, and you should do the discrete simulations from Monte Carlo. Moving on to the second dose point kernel, the DPK is commonly defined as a distribution of absorbed dose around an isotropic point source in an infinite homogeneous medium. DPK is defined for any radiation or any media. It is considered simply a function of distance r from a point source of radiation, where K of r is the DPK and absorbed dose per emitted particle, and the other terms are defined there. The DPK can be directly related to the Merck formalism through the equation of the particle energy for monoenergetic and the specific absorbed fraction, also as a function of r from the distance r from the point source. From a practical standpoint, r is frequently replaced by a scaled distance, r over r naught. And so r naught we take to be the CSDA range for charged particles, and for photons and other radionuclides, we use r sub 90, which is the radius of the sphere in which 90% of the energy is absorbed. So the scaled dimensionless DPK is usually given by this function capital F. And this is nice in reporting F in terms of these scale distances, where the F function, the scaled DPK, is invariant with media. That is, if two different media, you would get roughly the same value. So the relationship between the absolute and the scale is given by this equation, K scaled to F. Radionuclide specific DPKs can be determined by a weighted sum of the monoenergetic. So I need to know the decay scheme, the energies and yields of radiation particles, and then I can sum them up to get the radionuclide DPK. In monoenergetic and radionuclide DPKs are defined per particle and per decay, respectively. And because of the significantly different penetration ranges, it's common to distinguish between photon, electron, and alpha DPKs. In practice, photon DPKs are used at the orbital level, centimeter scale, in which case betas and alphas are considered non-penetrating. Electrons are the main input for voxel dosimetry, and then alpha DPKs can be used at subcellular, cellular, and multicellular level. Photon DPKs can be written both in terms of the primary radiation, where you have energy absorption proportional to the mass energy absorption coefficient, and then there's an exponential decrease in the photon fluence from distance r. And then when you wanted to add the dose contribution from scattered photons, you apply a buildup factor, B sub En. Charged particles is given by this expression, where dE dx is the energy loss per distance evaluated at that distance, being the residual range of the particle with initial energy E naught after traveling a distance r. And then just a footnote that dE dx is not necessarily the same as the stopping power, where x is radial distance and dl in the stopping power equation represents the particle trajectory. So DPK can be directly related to absorbed dose at a point, at a distance r from a point source, by scaling by n, total number of particles emitted by the source. Extension to real source volumes is made by superposition principle. It states that any three-dimensional source can be divided into an infinite number of point sources, and the absorbed dose to a target point is simply a superposition of absorbed dose contribution from many point sources. And then the superposition principle is given by this integral equation. When the source is a voxel, the expression can be recast as a dose voxel kernel, dVk. When the target is considered to be a volume of finite size, the convolution interval is transformed to a six-dimensional interval over XYZ dimensions over the source and the target. And then finally, radionuclide S values. So this is the third method of dose calculation in therapy nuclear medicine. So the S value represents the mean absorbed dose to a target region, R sub T, per radionuclide or per nuclear transformation of the radionuclide in a defined source region, R sub S. It is computed with required parameters being the energy yields of all radiations of the decaying radionuclide, the mass of the target region, and the absorbed fraction. And this is the expression here where small phi is the absorbed fraction, capital phi is what is called the specific absorbed fraction, where I've divided the absorbed fraction by the target mass. The S value is a quantity unique to both a specific radionuclide and the geometric definitions of source target, as well as intervening tissues. The Merz schema is highly adaptable to a variety of different applications, from whole organs to suborgan regions to tissue layers to cell clusters or individual cells. The S value may additionally be coupled with 3D imaging from PET and SPECT. The latter approach defines the S value at the voxel level. Radionuclide S values at the organ level have traditionally been computed in computational human phantoms. There are different format types of human phantoms, also morphometric categories. So we have historically stylized phantoms starting in the 1960s, voxel phantoms in the 1980s, and then in the early 2000s, we went to hybrid methods or polygon mesh phantoms. Morphometric categories could be from radiological protection. We have reference, so essentially a fixed number of 6 different ages, including newborn all the way up to adult, male and female, so only 12 phantoms at 50th percentile height and weight. If I relax those requirements, then I have what is called a patient-dependent library. So now I have a mixture of heights and weights from which I can morphometrically match to my patient. If I pull a phantom off that library and then do some reshaping to make sure that the body contour matches that of the patient, I have a patient-sculpted phantom. And then if I go inside and I tweak individual organs, then obviously then I have a patient-specific phantom. And in theory, each of the different 4 morphometric categories can be applied to any of the 3 format types. The radionuclide S values in the Merz schema can be applied multi-scale, whole organs, suborgan regions, image voxels, or even down to cells. But the base assumption is, regardless of your spatial scale, once you define the sources and the targets, the radiopharmaceutical is uniformly distributed over the source, and the dose is averaged uniformly over the target. One quick example of applying this at the microscale is looking at the nephron system in the kidneys. This was started by Robert Hobbs, published in 2012, in which the Merz schema now defines source and target compartments. In In the case of the kidneys, the source could be the proximal tubules and the target could be the glomerulus. A tilde is the time integrated activity in the whole kidney that you can image by PET and SPECT. The microscale S value is looking at sources and targets down at the nephron level. And then this G term is taking, it's called the time integrated activity apportionment factor. That is what fraction of the imaged whole kidney activity is localized to the glomerulus or the proximal tubules, for example. At the voxel level, we can use the merged schema. So imaging voxels can serve as sources regions as well as target regions under the merged schema. This concept was first started by Akabani and Liu in the late 90s. It was formalized in MERD pamphlet 17 and then extended using either DPKs in the Franquez 2003 or Amato 2012 by Monte Carlo. And Laconi et al. Had in 2012 had published a database, a free web accessible database for voxel S values. And then here's just a few examples, anywhere from bone metastasis dosimetry from samarium EDTMP to dose distributions from gold infused nanoparticles for intraterminal injection. I have lots of references, so I'll close and thank you for your attention. Happy to entertain any questions. And then in the handout, you can look at references for Monte Carlo, dose Monte Carlo, and then voxel S values. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wes. It was a very comprehensive presentation, and I think it will take perhaps some time for the audience to digest it and come up with the questions, because I don't see any right now. So please be in standby for the panel discussion. And now I think we'll move on to the next presentation. They will be by Dr. Yuni Dewaraja of University of Michigan, and she will be talking about advances in SPECT and PET imaging for patient-specific dosimetry.
Thank you for the opportunity to present today. These are my disclosures. I would also like to acknowledge grant funding from NIH. I will start with a brief overview on how patient-specific dosimetry is typically performed in radiopharmaceutical therapy. So the patient undergoes SPECT CT or PET CT imaging at multiple time points, and then these images are fed into a dose rate calculation algorithm. This calculation can be performed using very simple methods such as local energy deposition within the voxel, or more sophisticated methods such as Monte Carlo radiation transport. So both the CT and the SPECT are input for this calculation. And then this produces a dose rate maps, which then can be integrated to obtain the dose map. This dose map can then be used to generate dose volume histograms if you have segmentations available of the different organs and structures, as well as to perform radiobiologic dosimetry and obtain parameters such as the biological effective dose. I have also indicated here, there's much interest recently to try to reduce the imaging burden to the patient by replacing this multi-time point imaging with reduced time point approaches. I'm not going to go into those methods today, but there's much recent interest in that area. So why perform SPECT for radiopharmaceutical therapy dosimetry when we all know that PET has superior spatial resolution and sensitivity? However, most therapy radionuclides emit gamma rays that are suitable for SPECT and not positrons. As is evident from this table, where I have shown some of the most commonly used radionuclides, and you can see that most of them will emit beta particles or alpha emitters. However, they also emit gamma rays that are suitable for direct imaging, so you don't need a surrogate. Very few of these would have associated positrons for PET. PET also, however, plays a big role in radiopharmaceutical therapy, and that's because typically they are used as a surrogate imaging agent, exploiting the superior resolution and sensitivity. As you all know, the Theranostics pairs that are commonly used are gallium-68 PET, which is a surrogate for lutetium imaging for both dotatate and PSMA therapies. Typically, this is for visualization of uptake only because of the short half-life of gallium-68, it cannot be used for dosimetry, or we don't think it's suitable for dosimetry. Another pair, copper-64 and copper-67. In this case, there's a relatively longer half-life of Copper 64, you can see here 12.7 hours, that there's potential for dosimetry here. And then iodine 124 PET, which is a surrogate for iodine 131 radioiodine therapy. And here, this is well established that you can use this PET agent for dosimetry. Quantitative SPECT imaging of therapy radionuclides, however, is much more challenging than the typical technetium, for example. And this is evident if you look at their energy spectra. I have shown the energy spectra for 4 of the common radionuclides: lutetium-177, I-131, yttrium-90, and radium-223. In these cases, these spectra have been generated by Monte Carlo simulation. And the solid line is the total counts, and the dashed line here is the so-called contamination events or the undesired events. And as you can see in most of these radionuclides, the undesired events are a large fraction of the total spectrum. So these radionuclides typically have higher energy emissions, and there are also multiple photopeaks. And this leads to downscatter, and that is a big correction that has to be made. And then because of the higher energy of the photopeak or the gamma ray, we have to use higher energy collimators, which means there'll be poor resolution. So medium energy and high energy collimators, for example. The choice of collimator is very important with these radionuclides. These radionuclides often have low yields. For example, lutetium-177, the gamma ray intensity is only 10% for the 208 photopeak. So noise becomes an issue. Also, correction for scatter and collimator detector response is especially important with these radionuclides. As you can see here, this is the yttrium-90 spectrum, which is particularly challenging because of the continuous spectrum, and radium-223 because of these multiple low-intensity gamma ray emissions. Quantitative imaging of therapy radionuclides or PET imaging is also challenging than the diagnostic PET agents such as F18. And if you look at for example, the decay scheme of iodine-124 here is very complicated. These are not pure positron emitters. There are gamma rays that are also associated with these PET agents. They typically have low yields. A perfect example is yttrium-90, where the positron yield is very, very low, shown here. The positrons also have higher energies, so that it's, the positron range effects become important. So, and because of these gamma rays that I mentioned, the prompt gamma rays, this correction for these prompt gamma rays becomes especially important with these, some of these PET radionuclides. For example, here are some of the PET radionuclides that are significant in radiopharmaceutical therapies. Iodine-124 PET is low yield, prompt gammas, yttrium-90 ultra low yield, and also bremsstrahlung photons. Similarly, these other radionuclides have also associated challenges. I'll spend a little bit more time on the SPECT and PET imaging of yttrium-90, the challenges and the recent developments. So the main challenge with bremsstrahlung SPECT, as you all know, the bremsstrahlung is generated when the electron slows down in the tissue medium. And these photons can have a continuous energy spectrum. In the case of yttrium-90, this spectrum can range all the way up to 2 MeV. So then there's a lot of questions about where to position these acquisition windows and how to correct for downscatter of these high energy photons, which will be accepted in these lower energy acquisition windows. But however, there's been some recent developments with yttrium-90 PET bremsstrahlung imaging that has demonstrated that it's possible to do highly quantitative SPECT imaging with yttrium-90. So this is related to Monte Carlo reconstruction methods. And then our group has recently used deep learning scatter estimation for yttrium-90 PET, the SPECT. And then there's also some work we did to include the tissue-dependent bremsstrahlung yield in the reconstruction model. The main challenges with yttrium-90 PET is associated with the very low positron yield that I just mentioned. So you have low true coincidence rate in the presence of high singles rates because of the bremsstrahlung photons. And this is depicted here in this figure. Here is a true coincidence event here with indicated in black. And then you have all these bremsstrahlung photons, which I have shown in green, and these can occur in coincidence with one another, or in coincidence with the annihilation photons. Some of the recent developments in yttrium-90 PET have been to try to reduce the noise associated with this low count imaging. And people have shown that you can use penalized likelihood reconstruction to get better quantitative PET images. There's also some deep learning work that has been done to use trained regularizers for lower count PET. Then more recently, the higher timing resolutions of new PET time of flight systems have helped improve the quality of PET, yttrium-90 PET images. There's also improvements in sensitivity with digital PET and whole body PET, which helps a lot with these low count rate situations. References to these works can be found down here. I'm going to spend a little bit of time showing about the deep learning methods for scatter estimation that we developed within our group. And this was for yttrium-90 SPECT. It was a fairly simple deep learning CNN architecture, where we trained the CNN to estimate the scatter projections. And then these scatter projections were used in standard iterative reconstruction. So once the CNN was trained, and for the training, we used true scatter from a simulations of virtual patient phantoms. And you can see here the input to the CNN is the mu map, or the attenuation map, and the SPECT projections. And the trained CNN will generate the estimated scatter projections. This worked really well. We were able to show comparable results to our previous Monte Carlo-based scatter estimation for yttrium-90. But the time in both phantoms and patients, but the time with the CNN approach is only 40 seconds versus 80 minutes using 12 processors for a Monte Carlo-based method. Here are the results for a phantom. So the first, this is a phantom with challenging scatter conditions. So this is the middle of this multi-layer sphere was cold. There was no radioactivity in that region. So then the first image you're shown here is without scatter correction. This is the commercial reconstruction. This is with the Monte Carlo scatter corrections, with the CNN scatter correction, and the yttrium-90 PET, which generally is believed to be superior, much superior to yttrium-90 SPECT. So as you can see, there's a lot of contamination counts in these cold regions with the commercial reconstruction. With Monte Carlo reconstruction, the contrast is much improved. And the CNN's based method is comparable, and it's even reaching the quality of the yttrium-90 PET images. This is contrast to noise ratio showing this improvement. And here's an example of a patient. Here, the patient had a large necrotic region in the tumor here, outlined here. And the patient's SPECT image without scatter correction, the commercial reconstruction is shown first. Yttrium-90 SPECT with Monte Carlo scatter correction, SPECT with CNN scatter correction, which is very similar. But you must remember that this image was obtained with a matter of minutes, whereas this took several hours. And then the yttrium-90 PET image so the SPECT image is approaching that of the SPECT. If you take a profile across here, which is what I've shown here, you can see that with this, without scatter correction, you get a lot of counts in this area outside the tumor, outside the liver, where there should not be counts. And this, the necrotic region, there's a much improved contrast with the CNN and Monte Carlo scatter corrections. I'm going to briefly show you how we use yttrium-90 dosimetry in the clinic with an ongoing trial at the University of Michigan. This is a combined yttrium-90 and SBRT trial. So the patient first comes for the radioembolization treatment, and then we perform yttrium-90 PET and SPECT imaging. And these PET images are then used, and the SPECT images are used to then perform patient-specific dosimetry. And the dose map shown here is used to determine whether the patient will need a SBRT boost. So if the mean dose is less than 290 gray, which is a cutoff that we have determined from previous dose response studies, the patient goes on to get this boost. And that's what is indicated here. This lesion qualified for the SBRT. And then we also additionally take a dose painting approach, because we can use these dose maps, yttrium-90 dose maps in the SBRT treatment planning system, and identify voxels that need this to be boosted. So here in this example, the patient went on to get 6 gray, 5 fractions of 6 gray each, just to those regions that were underdosed by the yttrium-90. And this is the follow-up. The patient did quite well with a partial response. Developments in lutetium SPECT imaging for dosimetry. So the lutetium is not so challenging as yttrium-90. However, the gamma rays have low intensity, as I mentioned, only 10% for the commonly used 208 keV gamma ray. The approaches to improve low count imaging will facilitate whole body SPECT, which could be quite important with lutetium-177 PSMA therapies. So there have been deep learning approaches. There was recently a presentation where they used CNN to generate synthetic intermediate projections. And then our group has also done some work with joint dual photopeak reconstruction, exploiting both photopeaks here instead of using only the 208 photopeak, or instead of adding the 2 photopeaks, we perform a joint reconstruction with a stacked system model and showed improved performance. I would also briefly like to talk about a Theranostics SPECT reconstruction paper that came out recently from a group in Australia, and where they exploited gallium-68 PET information to improve the lutetium-177 SPECT reconstruction, which is what I show in the next slide. They used the PET information as a guiding or prior information to improve the SPECT reconstruction, similarly to what has been done in the past, where you use CT information to guide SPECT reconstruction. This was an attempt to reduce partial volume effects by exploiting the superior resolution of PET. Here's their example images that they showed. Here's the SPECT reconstruction, the standard SPECT reconstruction, the standard PET reconstruction, and here's the Theranostics SPECT reconstruction, where the SPECT was guided by the PET information. They also demonstrated this in a clinical application for for copper-64, copper-67 therapies, where the copper-67 SPECT reconstruction used PET information from the copper-64 PET. And here are the example images that they showed of the standard SPECT reconstruction and the Theranostics SPECT reconstruction. I'm not going to go into the details of imaging for dosimetry in targeted alpha therapy because I believe this topic was covered, except to say that this is quite challenging again because of the complex gamma ray emission spectrum associated with these radionuclides. But there is quite a few ongoing works to address these challenges. One more topic is deep learning approaches for SPECT and SPECT-based voxel dosimetry. The current gold standard for voxel dosimetry is Monte Carlo radiation transport. However, this is computationally very expensive. So the CNNs can potentially be trained to produce dose maps with accuracy comparable to Monte Carlo, but at a fraction of the time. These are some of the papers that have come out in this area. I would like to talk a little bit about work that done by our group in the next slide. So this is a network that we constructed to both perform the voxel level dosimetry as well as to compensate for the SPECT imaging resolution. So that was why it's called deblur DoseNet. So we have 2 tasks at the same time using a single CNN. This makes it a little different from the previous approaches where the CNN was trained only to perform dosimetry. Here's an illustration of the impact of SPECT resolution on dosimetry. So here is the XCAT phantom activity map of a kidney region. And if you feed this into a Monte Carlo voxel level dosimetry code, you can get a true dose rate map that is very similar to the actual activity map. And that's what's shown here. However, if you input this, the SPECT reconstruction corresponding to this activity map, even with the Monte Carlo voxel dosimetry, the dose rate map that you get is very different from the true dose rate map, and this is because of the SPECT resolution. So therefore, we trained our CNN using this true dose rate map. And then once we get a trained CNN, the SPECT images are input to that CNN, and it will produce dose rate maps that are more like the true dose rate map than even if you performed voxel level Monte Carlo dosimetry. So here are some of initial results from our method. Here's for a voxel phantom, virtual patient phantom. these are the SPECT and the CT that is inputted to this trained CNN. And here's the output of the CNN, the dose map from the CNN. We can see that it can be compared with the ground truth dose map, and also with the dose voxel kernel approach, or even Monte Carlo approach. And the differences are subtle, but you can indeed see an improvement in the resolution using this deep blur dose net, as indicated here, compared even with Monte Carlo. And this is more evident if you look at these the line profiles here. The ground truth dose map is in green, and the CNN generated dose map in red, and they are much closer to one another than to Monte Carlo. This is also evident if you look at the absolute mean dose rate errors for different organs here. The yellow is the CNN-based estimate, and the comparison is with the ground truth here, and that the CNN produces the lowest percentage difference compared to the ground truth. I'm finally going to wrap up now with just a couple of slides just to indicate that there's much going on, both also with in terms of new software and new hardware that is going to be beneficial or will facilitate patient-specific dosimetry. And so one main advance has been the availability of quantitative SPECT with state-of-the-art camera systems. Some systems are built with built-in source holders and calibration standards. There are the systems where specific calibration procedure and can be entered is specified, and the user can enter the calibration factors. So some of these new software systems are indicated here. I don't have time to go into this, but I think this is a big step towards performing patient-specific dosimetry. There's also a lot of recent developments with PET systems to improve the quantification, which will benefit dosimetry very much. These are indicated here. In addition to improved resolution and efficiency, there's better performance at high count rates, which will facilitate therapy, post-therapy imaging. That's all I have time for, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Yuni, for this presentation. It's, again, very comprehensive, a lot of data. And I believe that we have questions and we'll address them, but I think that we might like to move to the panel session. What do you think, George?
Yeah, I think we can move directly to the panel discussion and take all of the questions that are available. I have one for Dr. Van Nostrand, which, and he's not here, but I think our distinguished panel and speakers may be able to give some insights to the question. And that is the data for thyroid cancer and bone marrow dose are really striking. What are the barriers to wider adoption of the methodology that Dr. Van Nostrand described? So appears to be concern over a bone marrow. Can we get any comments from our panel on this question?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is George Sgouros. What's interesting is that if anything, the trend is in the other direction. There's a concerted effort by the community to move away from radioiodine treatment. I'm sort of channeling what Doug would have said, because I know him quite well. I've worked with him, and he's really concerned that patients are being offered agents that move away from radioiodine treatment, which is actually tremendously effective up to a certain point. So I think what's preventing continued use of this approach is sort of the practice community practice, perhaps the expense of doing I-124 PET, and the idea that these patients do reasonably well overall. It's not one of the main killers in terms of cancer, and in part it's not because of I-131 radioiodine therapy. Metastatic thyroid cancer is pretty well treated.
Okay. Any other comments on this question?
So to follow up, this is Vikram. To follow up, George, you said one of the barriers is the cost of I-124. Jehanne, do you have any thoughts on that? How we can reduce that barrier?
I'm sorry, reduce which value?
I-124.
Can the cost of iodine-124 be reduced since that poses a barrier for the types of therapy that Dr. Van Nostrand was presenting?
I'm afraid that's not an isotope that that we produce, so I can't comment about what is involved in the costs for those isotopes. I know for those that we produce, since we're a government entity, although cost of doing business at national labs is not cheap, but we only charge full cost recovery, and for isotopes that are for research purposes, we even subsidize a little bit. But I can't comment to what the commercial entities do.
Right, so it's not just the isotope cost, it's just the cost of doing a PET scan, which is pretty high in many nuclear medicine departments these days.
Okay, if there are no further comments on that question, I believe we have two for, let me find them here. Dr. Dewaraja. So one comes from Dr. Day in LSU. How many training data sets are typically needed for the CNN for scatter correction? Would you have advice on generating training sets via Monte Carlo?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. So for this case, for our yttrium-90 scatter correction, I believe we had only about 10 training sets, and they were all generated by Monte Carlo simulation. They were virtual patients. So we take the patient images and we make them into phantoms so that we can make them as realistic as possible. So we start with the patient's actual SPECT CT scan, and we use their activity maps and the patient's density map to generate the virtual patients. But we did a Monte Carlo simulation of the whole process, because that's the only way you can get the ground truth. For scatter, you can't measure the scatter only component, but you can definitely get it from Monte Carlo. So all the training was done with Monte Carlo simulated ground truth labels of virtual patients. And then that we were able to limit to only using 10 training sets, because this was a fairly simple CNN architecture. It was a 2D architecture, and each patient gave us 128 projections. So although we had 10 virtual patients, you have to multiply that by 128. I hope that answered your question.
Yep. Looks like there's a part 2 and a part 3 from the same attendee. Thank you for a great talk. She says, can you comment on the uncertainty comparison between dosimetry results using standard image recon methods versus the more advanced methods you've considered in your research? Yuni.
Yes, so the uncertainty in the dose estimation is coming mostly. I don't believe the biggest component is from the image reconstruction. I think the biggest contribution to the uncertainty is from definition of the structures, which is done independently on typically in anatomical images. The volume of interest definition has a lot of uncertainty, especially for tumor. So that is a large source of uncertainty, because that impacts not only the definition of the region, but also it impacts the partial volume correction that you perform and the total counts that you get. So that is a big source of uncertainty, which has been reduced to some extent with deep learning methods, not so much for tumor, but for the other organs. So now we have deep learning methods for kidney and liver outlining, and those are pretty consistent, and the uncertainty has been reduced. But for tumor dosimetry, that is still a large source of uncertainty.
Okay. All right, I misspoke. That first question was from Spencer Manuel, and the second part of that question is how reliable are images reconstructed using standard correction methods for dose estimates?
Okay, so that's a good question again. That is going to depend on what you're trying to calculate the dose to. I believe it is pretty reliable for large organs. You can get good accuracy using standard reconstructions, for example, the liver. However, when you come to small structures like tumor, your reconstruction method becomes very important, and the corrections that you do, and this is because of partial volume effects. When you say standard reconstruction, you want to make sure that you have collimator detector response included in your reconstruction, which is kind of routine now in most commercial software. But even with those corrections, it's pretty hard to quantify anything less than, say, 2 cc's in volume with SPECT. With PET, again, also partial volume correction is pretty important. And then you can go down to about 1 cc with PET, but anything smaller than that, it's not very reliable. Although you can improve things by doing partial volume correction, we still don't have a good voxel level partial volume correction method. We have recovery coefficients, which are mean value corrections. But if you want to correct at the voxel level, that's not sufficient. So these are still challenges with standard reconstruction methods. But certainly the biggest correction you want to do is this collimator detector response correction or resolution recovery in the case of PET, because attenuation and scatter is pretty standard, but this is an extra correction that is definitely needed.
Thank you very much. Joanne, we have a question from Stephanie Lamart from the French Institute for Radiation Protection and Nuclear Medicine, underlining the fact that this is an international workshop now. So, and the question is, should the physical half-life make it possible? Is it feasible to purchase the isotope from abroad? I'm not sure whether that's referring to an isotope.
Or is it the DOE sources?
So yes, Stephanie, we have many international stakeholders, and we supply isotopes both for international research as well as international commercial entities. So anyone who's interested in an isotope can go to www.isotopes.gov. When it comes to research isotopes that we subsidize, we look to see whether the international research application, it has to meet a couple criteria in order to get the subsidized research cost. But if the international effort includes US scientists, then it can automatically get the lower price. Otherwise, it's at full cost recovery.
George, Emily has her hand up.
Yes, let's take that. There's another typed question in, but Emily, would you like to pose your question or comment?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to follow up on Yuni's discussion about the uncertainty in the dose accuracy. One thing that we observed in our study here at UC Davis in the liver for Y90 is also that the low count regions are affected by the uncertainty. And what we're doing is that right now we're comparing conventional PET with the Explorer PET, which has a greater sensitivity. And we find that the low count is probably the largest source of uncertainty we have, especially in small volumes of interest. So it can be a smaller liver segment, but of course it applies to tumor dosimetry. So I wanted to ask Yuni what was her opinion on that, and if that's something they observe as well.
I'm assuming you're talking about low counts with yttrium-90 PET, not SPECT.
Yes, yes, and with PET, sorry, I should have
yeah, definitely for
that.
yttrium-90 SPECT, the low counts is an issue. I was talking more in general for dosimetry. The definition, volume definition is the biggest source, but if you're considering yttrium-90, low counts is an issue, not so much for tumor, but for the lower background region, liver background region.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you think that would be true if we were looking at small tumors, small metastases, even for lutetium-177? Wouldn't we see the same if we go to other applications?
With lutetium-177, because we do a 20-30 minute, if we do typically 20-minute count, even though the gamma ray intensity is 10%, I think there's plenty of counts.
Yeah, even in small.
Especially after, because we image after 7 gigabecquerels of administration. So post-therapy imaging with lutetium-177 is not an issue, but if you ever want to do tracer quantities of lutetium, which people don't do yet, then the low counts.
Yeah, we have a couple clinical trials and research studies which involve a lower dose of lutetium-177. And definitely this is something that now we're facing because we have lower counts, especially when we image at day 7.
Right. So then one thing that I think I briefly mentioned that our group is doing is the dual photopeak reconstruction is helping. You get twice as many counts because the 113 gamma ray is not used typically in commercial systems, but it's very readily usable with this proper corrections. And then some groups have been doing deep learning methods to improve the low count lutetium, but I think that would be not for Lutathera applications, but other where you don't administer that much. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's another question. I believe, Yuni, this is for you, and we may need to try and interpret it. It's not immediately clear to me, but let me read it from Gabriela Losa. Other than the worst performance or not as good performance of SPECT systems for high energy single photon radioisotopes, would it be advantageous to develop them, or are there other inconvenience or other shortcomings?
Of high energy, I don't quite understand the question. So the biggest problem is with high energy photons is that you have to use a high energy collimator, which reduces the resolution. And other than that, in terms of radiation safety, there are issues. People don't like to use I-131 because of the patient having to be restricted after the therapies. In terms of imaging, the gamma cameras are not designed for high energy. Their angle cameras are originally designed for technetium energies, so they're not the best systems, but
I think we alluded to some of those shortcomings in yesterday's presentations, and this is partially what we tried to motivate in this workshop, and that is currently SPECT images are not very good for therapy planning. Maybe there are instrumentation scientists on that. I think in particular, Dr. Meng mentioned that there are possibilities to relook at Compton cameras that have increased sensitivity and reasonable resolution. So although the state of the art for SPECT for these radioisotopes is not the best, perhaps we can motivate some research and development that would improve these images. So that's a good question that simultaneously poses the challenge of this workshop. Dr. Hum has posed a general question. Bone marrow is the prevalent dose limiting organ for radionuclide therapies, but we know that the red marrow reserve changes with age and is different for the different bones. Patients may have also received prior chemotherapy. As radionuclide therapies increase in prevalence in cancer management, are there methods to assess the volume of variable bone marrow for an individual patient that could inform on marrow dose limits? So this seems to be pointing at Dr. Van Nostrand. George Sgouros, maybe you have a comment for this question.
Right. It's I know that Wes is. I know that at Sloan Kettering and also I know Wes was involved in looking at changes in marrow cellularity. I guess if there's a way to assess that, and I remember at Sloan Kettering way back, I think Doug Ballin was looking at a sequence that would assess by MR cellularity of marrow in a patient. If you can come up with parameters that can feed into some set of equations that give you the change, the geometry, then you have a better calculation of the marrow dose. Radiosensitivity, I mean, I think that's a tough one. It's the kind of thing that is more of a clinical sort of view. You base it on what you know about outcomes for patients that have been previously treated.
George, I would comment, Stephen Graves has been doing a little bit of work with FLT3 imaging. So there are ways of potentially imaging, maybe not directly, but indirectly marrow reserve. And then there's the structural things, and Yuni's done this in her group as well, using dual energy CT to piece out what the bone marrow density, as well as and then using MR techniques to do fat and water suppression imaging to get cellularity. So there's a lot of imaging. Michael Lassman has had a series of students over the last, kind of carried some of the work that we started at Florida many years ago. And has been pushing it. The whole idea is, can we do patient-specific marrow dosimetry? And I keep coming back to the statement that, you know, people say, well, what is your marrow dose? And you give a number, and then I can come up and say, there's not a single cubic centimeter of marrow that receives that dose. Every bone in your body is a different organ. It has a different microstructure. It has a different potential cellularity. It certainly has a different marrow trabecular structure. And this idea that we calculated, if you actually get into the details of calculating marrow dose, you have to do it bone by bone and then take a weighted average. And so in the end, the marrow dose that we ascribe is really a mathematical construct. So it gets so complicated, but you're absolutely right. You can refine the dosimetry, but then it's really the dose response relationship, and how to individualize it requires maybe even further imaging.
The reason that I actually asked this question is because if you compare radionuclide therapy dosimetry with external beam, a major role of an external beam dosimetry, of course, is to determine the dose to the critical structures that surround the tumor. And so really in radionuclide dosimetry, that's in addition to getting tumor dose estimates, which is very, very important, we need to have a reliable method of determining the dose to dose limiting tissues. And I think, you know, some of those dose limiting tissues, bone marrow is by far the most important one. It comes up in almost every form of radionuclide therapy, except in the Y90 radioembolization studies that Yuni just explained. And the others would be obviously salivary gland, certainly with the PSMA therapies coming along. So it is somewhat tricky to try to determine how much, you know, marrow reserve you have. I guess we could just have a conservative approach, like what Van Nostrand kind of in a way implied, and we do it for thyroid dosimetries. We just simply say that if we stay below 2 gray defined, we don't actually determine marrow dose, we estimate it. We say it's equivalent to that of blood dose. So we take blood samples and then do serial blood imaging and use that as a surrogate. So I think if there is a surrogate and we say we're going to, you know, always remain below this, and not do any further personalization in a way other than, you know, taking serum blood samples, then that may be satisfactory. But it is challenging, and so I pose that question, not expecting to get a fabulous answer, but it's something we need to think about. I mean, in a way, I think MRI approaches may be the way to go to determine what fraction of the marrow you still have viable marrow that's there, that still can divide.
It is a challenge from the physics side. What's great from the biology side is that you get a readout really quickly, so you can come up with dose response studies in a way that doesn't risk the patient as much as, for example, renal toxicity, which the burden on predicting renal toxicity is a lot higher in terms of the dose calculation you have to do, because you don't get that until, I don't know, 9 months or something later. And you don't want to wait 9 months. In fact, there are examples of agents, and there was a bit of that yesterday where for the lutetium work, for example, patients have received doses to the kidneys quite a bit greater than the ones based on limitations from radiotherapy, from the external beam radiotherapy experience.
So I just wanted to add that with the imaging-based marrow dosimetry, one of the biggest problems we have is that you pretty much need to image the whole body to get all of the marrow in, and with SPECT that is very hard. So we do try to do marrow dosimetry, imaging-based dosimetry, but we typically have just one field of view.
I see Dr. Meng has his hand up and he's waving on his video. I think he has something to say with regard to the SPECT discussion that we just touched upon and discussed previously. So Dr. Meng, would you like to jump in on the SPECT question here?
Sure. Yes, I do have a few questions. I mean, as a full-time system developer, I would say there are a lot of solutions out there, but it would be better to have a better understanding about what is needed. So that's my question is about. So I do have a little more specific question. For example, this is one simple one. Is currently is regarding small animal, large animal patient studies and so on. So what is the main vehicle, right, at this point for all the research in therapy? So is more study being carried out in animals or more being carried out in patients? So that's the first question, which
I think, are you posing that to Yuni as a question or to the general panel?
To the general panel, I just want to learn a little bit more on this aspect.
Yeah, I guess I would say it depends on how good your clinical collaborators are and how willing they are to help write protocols, and also how much money you have in terms of grant support and how much time you want to spend putting together patient studies and trying to get them funded. So typically the pathway is you start with cells, you make sure things are working in cell culture, you move to animals, make sure things are working in animals, and then in most cases, depending on the group you're with and the facilities you have, you stop there at Sloan Kettering, you just plow ahead and move to humans pretty quickly.
All right, so my interpretation would be they are all important, but depending on the specific approach that you're collaborating with. Yeah. Another question which I have is, there are a lot of discussions regarding dosimetry and so on, so therapeutic delivery and so on. I'm wondering, is there any prospect of, say, combining this the study of therapeutic delivery with some kind of diagnostic process? For example, is there any need for simultaneously imaging the delivery of alpha therapy at the same time look at the delivery of certain diagnostic agent? So if you can see, for example, if you use technetium, IMIBG or some other delivery into the body, and without, if you have simultaneously have the image revealing the delivery of alpha therapy. So that combination of therapeutic and the diagnostic aspect, if the imaging capability allow you to see both at the same time, does it buy you anything?
Keeping in mind that the absorbed dose delivered, depending on the half-life of the agent and the kinetics, takes a certain amount of time. My sense is, and maybe others can weigh in, simultaneously assessing what's happening is probably not going to give you a tremendous amount. It may, it depends on the dose rate, but my initial reaction is that that's something you want to look at after a certain amount of time. And then you want to look at markers that speak to potential toxicity, long-term toxicity, markers that speak to response, sort of similar to the question that John asked about marrow issues and how do you assess radiosensitivity, things like that. I can't think of any agents.
I would like to add this one exception though, which is the radioembolization. I think there's big value in being able to do the technetium planning study at maybe on the same day or at the same time, and then do the yttrium-90 delivery, because the technetium doesn't really go anywhere. So you don't have to wait to image multiple time points. So there has been at least 2 groups that have been trying to do real-time radioembolization and the planning on the same within a few hours. But it's technically quite a big process to do both those procedures, but
yes,
that has been tried. So then,
there seem to
depending
be
on the technetium study, they can either increase more, give more yttrium-90 as needed.
Yeah. There seem to be several questions coming in on the bone marrow discussion that we've had. So let me read those and see if we can't get some answers back. The first one actually is from Stephanie Lamart, again from France, to Wes Bolch. Would you have any suggestions or comments regarding the bone marrow dosimetry for alpha emitters, current methods? Another question from Dr. Quo in Tucson. Any insight on progress on estimating bone marrow dose in patients with bone metastases? And there's one from Daniel Lee. New Orleans clinical information such as blood counts and response to prior myosuppressive insults, pre-existing marrow conditions such as Gaucher's may inform decisions about bone marrow reserve. That seems to be a comment, but perhaps that can enter into the discussion. So the original question was posed to Wes, and maybe after his discussion, others can chime in. You want to start the discussion on bone marrow or continue the discussion on bone marrow, Wes?
Sure, and thank you for the question, Stephanie. One of the problems, and this has to do with whole body phantoms as well, right? So the historical development of nuclear medicine dosimetry was kind of in tandem with development of dosimetry for radiological protection. So we kind of latched on to reference phantoms, and that's true for bone marrow dosimetry, right? For many years, we kind of looked at the early cord-based models, University of Leeds. Those were adopted by radiological protection in the ICRP. Keith Eckerman then carried them forward into his work in bone marrow dosimetry. And so even the work that we've done at University of Florida, it's a reference male cadaver and a reference female cadaver that we did a very detailed imaging, but it's a reference model, right? It's not. So I think the next generation of bone marrow dosimetry models needs to be adjustable. And everybody goes back to, I need a cellularity. So you go to ICRP publication 70, and there's this nice little table, and this for this bone, here's the marrow cellularity. Well, that's the reference individual. It's not the individual patient. So we need to be working. A couple of things. We need to be working on an adjustable model, maybe different skeletal sizes, different bone marrow densities, different variations in cellularity. The other important component is the target. What is red marrow, right? What are the targets, right? So a lot of, and this goes back to the kind of the marriage of convenience between radiological protection and therapy, nuclear medicine. The emphasis of radiological protection has always been stochastic risk, leukemia risk, bone cancer, right? So the targets of endosteum, the averaging, looking at red marrow for leukemia risk, are those really at the cellular level? Are those really appropriate targets for marrow toxicity? So now we're getting away from stochastic risk to deterministic risk, to what ICRP now calls tissue reactions. We did some early studies in the late 2000s where we actually looked at cell counting of different CD positive markers for hematopoietic stem and cell and progenitor cells, and found a pretty substantial gradient of concentration as you move away from the trabecular surface. Well, why is that important? Well, right now we just average the dose across the whole marrow cavity, right? So that's implicitly assuming that the concentration of your target cells is uniform, and it is not. And so if you've got kind of unspecific localization of the radiopharmaceutical, it's probably okay. If you've got a radiopharmaceutical that binds to the bone surfaces or the bone volumes, and you're emitting short-range radiations, you've got a dose gradient across the marrow cavities. And so then the question of the concentration gradient from the bone surface becomes really, really important. So we've explored that in our publications. Rob Hobbs did a study with a simplistic but very informative spherical model of the marrow cavities, keeping track of dose as a function of distance from the surface. So a lot of complicated things. So I don't know if I answered your question, Stephanie, but we and really the ICRP, and I have to compliment Stephanie Lamar is now joining committee 2 on ICRP. So we're really moving away from individual reference models for dosimetry. When we try to advance radiopharmaceutical therapy, we've got to have adjustable models in not only in the dosimetry, but what does that dose mean in terms of response?
So Dr. Quo's question on metastases was directed towards Yuni. Do you have anything to respond about bone marrow metastases and dosimetry?
So again, we have tried to look at this situation also, but it's very hard to distinguish between the metastases and the marrow itself. Just thresholding the PET or SPECT scan does not help sometimes. They're all intermingled. We have even actually started looking at doing some sulfur colloid scans that can distinguish which regions are marrow versus there won't be uptake in the marrow or tumor. I can't remember which way around it is, but one of them is not going to show uptake in the sulfur colloid scan, but it would show uptake in the regular lutetium scan. So it's a challenge again. It's just a very small space, and there's very hard to distinguish which region is the marrow and which region is the lesion.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'm going to extend for an additional 2 minutes if we can go over a little bit. There are 2 remaining questions that I will merge into one question for general comments. And they are both pointed towards Yuni again. One comes in from Julia Brosch-Lenz in Germany, again, underlining the fact that we are an international workshop. And that reads, they would like to ask if you could comment on what, quote, standard we need to be defined or the whole dosimetry workflow, for example, imaging, recons, VOI fitting, dose conversion. If everyone is following the same steps, I would assume we would be able to correlate certain dose thresholds with response or toxicity of organs and tumors. Then it wouldn't matter if we were 40% off, if all centers are that same factor off. Again, do you foresee expansion of integrated radiopharmaceutical therapy and radiotherapy in the future, including integrating absorbed equivalent dose? And what would the needs on the radiopharmaceutical side be to make that feasible? So a lot in those 2 questions, but they both point to you, Yuni. So maybe you would like to kind of consider them and give your concluding remarks for this panel discussion since we are over.
Okay, I will quickly answer Dr. Lenz's question. I hope you are aware of our dosimetry challenge organized by the Society of Nuclear Medicine, which is one way we are trying to look at how the different practices vary across the different centers and how to standardize. So that will give us a lot of information, which we can make some recommendations after analyzing that data. But I must add that standardization is going to be difficult, although it is ideal, it is difficult because a lot of people have, each center has their own favorite method that they want to use. And I'm maybe not willing to give up their method to accept one general method. One example is definition of volumes. Not every place can have the access to a radiologist who would do this outlining of lesions like we use here at Michigan, which is, I think, the best way. So we can't make that the standard because a lot of places will not have that capability. And also similarly for reconstruction, each camera company has their own favorite reconstruction method. So I think it's going to be quite hard to do this standardization, although that is the ideal. Then regarding the other question about expansion of radiopharmaceutical therapy and combining with radiotherapy, that's a great question. I think that is really the way to go in and make in situations where we are seeing underdosing from one therapy to see if we can boost those regions with another different therapies, again, different radiation therapies, I think a great possibility. And your question about, I think that is feasible also for the lutetium PSMA therapies that we like to look at that possibility. About integrating absorbed dose and equivalent dose, that becomes an issue because the 10 gray, for example, from internal therapy is not the same as 10 gray from external therapy. So how do we combine these information from one therapy and the other? You can go to the BED or the equivalent uniform doses. However, in certain cases, that's also not the solution, like with the yttrium-90 therapies. Because of the microscale distribution of the microspheres, the EUD calculation is not very meaningful when you do it based on PET and SPECT imaging. We can't get the underlying microscale distribution of the PET, of the microspheres by doing PET imaging. Although some places in Europe, I think it's Dr. Stefan Wallren's group, thinks that they can do that with very high resolution PET reconstructions that they are able to get the microscale distribution. So there are a lot of challenges in terms of when you're combining the doses of getting the total dose, even with biologically effective dose or equivalent uniform dose. But I think there's a lot to gain in the future if we can do some studies, and we are trying to look at how we can equate the tumor control probability studies from the yttrium-90, for example, with the tumor control probability curves from external therapy to find whether we can do some kind of scaling to see what the equivalent doses are in that case.
Thank you very much. That was a pretty exciting and information-filled panel discussion. Went a little longer than we expected. Why don't we take a 10-minute break now? That will go a little late than originally planned. I think if we come back together at 1 o'clock, then we'll only be 5 minutes late off of our agenda schedule. Then we can conclude by introducing George Sgouros' grand overview and then some wrap-up discussions afterwards. So I think everybody could use a short little bio break, a stretch. We'll come back at 1 o'clock and resume the rest of today's meeting. So I thank all of the panel discussants, all of the speakers, all of the type-in questions, especially from France and Germany. It is great to know that there is interest and viewership across the Atlantic. Thank you all very much, and we'll be back at 1 o'clock. Thank you. Well, we're coming to the conclusion of what I believe is a very, very successful workshop. We thank everyone for all of their contributions. And I would like to invite Dr. George Sgouros to give us an overview of the workshop and the discussions. For those of you who do not know Dr. Sgouros and why we invited him, well, we did a little bit of research on Dr. Sgouros, and by going to PubMed and typing in George Sgouros with a keyword of therapy, we noticed that since 2002, he has 87 publications on therapy applications in PubMed. If you type in George Sgouros and imaging or nuclear medicine imaging, he has 63 publications since 2003 on that topic, with the most recent in both topics with publications this year in 2021. A prominent publication of his as first author is the MERD, a Medical Internal Radiation Dose Pamphlet, published by the Society of Nuclear Medicine. He is first author on pamphlet 22, Radiobiology and Dosimetry of Alpha Particle Emitters for Targeted Radionuclide Therapy, published in 2010. Other MERD pamphlets that he has co-authored include MERD pamphlet number 19, 20, 21, 23, 24, 26. So without taking much more time to list his accomplishments and background, we are confident that Dr. Sgouros has the background and experience in therapy and imaging applications to give a grand overview of this workshop and make any concluding insights that he may have. Type in your questions during his live presentation, and hopefully we can have some concluding discussions at the end before we adjourn for this meeting. So without further ado, George, we are looking forward to your live presentation of grand overview, electron and alpha emitting radiotherapy agents and the need to image them.
George, let me just say, I guess I started early, so, and part of the MERD committee helps you rack up the publication. So I would say more to the credit of people I've worked with than what I've personally done. But I also want to thank you so much for this invitation and for the opportunity to I'm not sure it's a grand overview. It's sort of my take on what I think needs to happen more than anything else. I mean, so far it's been a fantastic, absolutely amazing workshop. I'm again delighted at this opportunity. So I'll stop wasting time and go ahead and start presenting. So the title of my presentation is Peering into the Black Box of Cancer Therapy. And it relates to the grand overview thing, as you'll see, it's sort of in an indirect way. So I do have some disclosures. I want to, I remember when NIBIB was first added to the National Institutes of Health back in 2000. I was really worried that it would take money away from grants that I was desperately trying to get. So it's the second youngest. The youngest institute is the Health Disparities Institute. And I'd like to sort of play a bit on that theme that NIBIB is the youngest one and we're looking to the oldest one, NCI. So in that context, in the tradition of the youngest generation challenging the oldest, this is sort of the background to the talk I'm going to give. So let's start with cancer therapy. systemic cancer therapy has been delivered for more than 75 years without imaging, pharmacokinetics, and biodistribution. Imaging really has been limited to diagnosis, response assessment, and more recently to patient selection and qualifying patients for therapy, kind of theranostics. So I'd like to advance the following hypothesis that imaging therapeutic agents, which we can now do, will improve the efficacy of the drugs that we give for cancer therapy and potentially improve patient outcomes. So let's sort of by way of introduction, let's set the stage for this hypothesis. So if we look at the record, one way to look at the record is to assess the success rate of oncologic drugs. There are other ways. Patient outcomes is the traditional thing. But since NCI is focused on new treatments, I'd like to look at how new treatments fare. So this is a paper published in 2019 from a group in biostatistics that took a very interesting approach to understanding the success rate. So the success rate from phase 1 to phase 2 for a whole bunch of different medical conditions and related therapeutic agents sort of provides the probability of transitioning from phase 1 to phase 2, likewise probability of transitioning from phase 2 to phase 3, and so on. And then overall, so what's interesting is you have a lot of numbers here. This is 3.4% for oncologic agents. I think showing it this way makes it a lot clearer. So oncologic agents, for some reason, are really tough to get to success. 97%, so 3 out of 100, roughly 3 out of 100 agents that are tested in humans tend to fail if they're oncologic drugs. In fact, oncology is a downer. So if you take out oncology, the success rate across all diseases is about 21%. You bring in oncology, drops down to about 14%. So let's explore a little bit why that might be. A lot of these agents are targeted therapy. So this is from the NCI website. And I know I do, but I'm not. I know I do get a lot of my support from NCI, and I know Jacek is on the thing also. I don't want to make too much of this, but right. So targeted therapy, foundation of precision medicine. So this is interesting, right? Treatment that targets proteins that control how cancer cells grow, divide, and spread. I don't see the word kill here anymore. So chemotherapy used to kill cells. It also killed other cells. We've now transitioned into controlling how cancer cells grow, divide, and spread. And the other interesting thing about this is that there's no mention here. So we talk about toxins delivered by monoclonal antibodies, no mention of delivering radionuclides. So let's probe a little bit more into what targeted therapies have been doing. So just sort of as more background, basically the principle of targeted therapies is that you identify a signaling pathway that controls growth, division, and spread of cancer cells. And then you look for, first you identify the biological pathway, and a lot of work's been done to do that. And then you look for drugs, small molecules or pharmaceuticals that go inside the cell and inhibit that pathway, or you find antibodies that actually on the cell surface block signaling. The most successful one has been trastuzumab for breast cancer on the outside, and imatinib, which isn't shown here, in terms of an inhibitor of a signaling pathway that leads to cancer cell growth, proliferation, and dissemination. And then more recently, there are these more immunologically oriented agents that really focus on the interaction of cancer cells with the immune system. It turns out that cancer cells have cell surface markers that tell the immune system not to attack it. And if you block those markers, then you increase the ability of the immune system to recognize a cell as a cancer cell. And then in prostate cancer and breast cancer, tamoxifen has been a fantastic agent for breast cancer, and abiraterone and enzalutamide likewise. Enzalutamide acting on suppressing the receptor, and abiraterone on suppressing the hormone binding to the receptor. So this bar here, again, for those that aren't, the bar basically means inhibition, and the arrow means proliferation. So in one case, you're inhibiting the signal, in the other case, you're promoting the signal. So if you can inhibit any one of these pathways, then you're impacting how whether the cancer cell remains a cancer cell. So that's a novel approach. This is an image from the Hallmarks of Cancer paper that comes out every decade or so, that just highlights the different pathways. So there are quite a few pathways that impact how cancer cells behave. And if we focus on let's say this one right here, P10 inhibiting AKT, and maybe zoom in on this a little bit. So here's P10, and here's AKT. So in the previous slide, it was kind of an abridged slide. So P10 was directly inhibiting AKT. What it's really doing is it's inhibiting PI3K, which is a promoter of PDK1, which promotes AKT. So inhibiting the promoters is the same as inhibiting the target itself. And you know, there are other ways of increasing the target. So for example, mTOR serves to promote this action of this. This TEL2 competes with P10 to increase, to promote this molecule. And so the point is, it's a complicated system. You really need to understand the biology. And there's a lot of redundancy built in, tremendous amount of redundancy. The other thing, and when I first read this, I was really shocked. The other thing is that in many cases, we've missed the target. So here's a paper published in 2019, Science Translation Medicine, a group out in Long Island. Anyway, so their title is Off-Target Toxicity is a Common Mechanism of Action of Cancer Drugs Undergoing Clinical Trials. So this is sort of an understated way of saying that a lot of these targeting agents are missing the target. So, and here's actually the quote from their paper. Contrary to previous reports obtained predominantly with RNA interference and small molecule inhibitors, the proteins ostensibly targeted by these drugs are non-essential for cancer cell proliferation. Moreover, the efficacy of each drug that we tested was unaffected by the loss of its putative target, indicating that these compounds kill cells via off-target effects. Another very complicated way of saying that a lot of these agents are missing the target. And they found this out because they identified targets that are presumably critical for a cancer cell being a cancer cell, for its growth, proliferation, and spread. Turns out that if you go in with a much more definitive approach to eliminating these targets, CRISPR, so you generate cells that don't have these targets at all, and then you discover that these cells are pretty, happy cancer cells. They don't lose their ability to be cancer cells. In the meantime, the industry has developed all these drugs that are supposed to target these agents. They kind of work. So the conclusion is that, the title of the paper is that they work mostly because they're targeting something that's not what we think it is. It's an off-target effect. So these agents have been used in 29 different trials. About 1,000 patients have gone through these things. And it turns out the drugs were targeting something irrelevant to whether a cancer cell grows and divides and spreads. And part of that is that it costs a lot of money to pump 100 potential drugs through a process, phase 1 through 3, and then only have 3 come out and get approved. So there's this thing called financial toxicity. Over over the years, we see over about a decade, the price of these agents, the monthly price of these agents has tripled. According to ASCO, American Society of Clinical Oncology, the gain has been minimal, or non-existent, I guess. This is data from 42 phase trials, and here's the paper from Journal of Oncology Practice. So over the past decade, cost of novel oncology drugs has increased, while clinical benefits have not experienced a proportionally positive. Financial toxicity is actually a real thing. Some of these authors are positing the idea that the strain on patients of the expense associated with these drugs is having a medical impact, and physicians need to account for it to the same extent that they account for example, hematologic blood count loss. Okay, so that was the background. So let's talk a little bit now about radiopharmaceutical therapy of cancer and its key features. It is a systemically, potentially local regionally administered agent, local regional, and we've seen a lot of that in the HCC trials with intrahepatic artery therapy for liver cancer. So that means that one can target disseminated and metastatic cancer. It causes radiation-induced DNA damage, and that means the mechanism of action is well understood. We kill cells, we don't control their behavior. So in a sense, that's a relatively simple approach to cancer therapy. It's truly targeted. We're not delivering the agent to all cells and then having an impact on those that depend on that particular signaling pathway. So it's a truly targeted delivery of radiation. And radiation, we understand that centuries worth of knowledge regarding its biological effects. Because we can target an image, and I'll get to the imaging later on, that allows for absorbed dose-based treatment planning. There are some caveats to that. And clearly, we're less reliant on understanding the cancer biology. We just need to identify something that will concentrate the agent. And then the question is, where does it go? Where else does it concentrate? And how long does it stay there? That's really the basic principle of radiopharmaceutical therapy. So efficacy depends on differential delivery of radiation, pretty straightforward. As we saw in one of the early talks yesterday, it's quite modular. You have multiple structures. You can do all kinds of things with antibodies, including we saw the Dr. Larson's work with Sarah Cheel on pre-targeting techniques and establishing platforms to change the pharmacokinetics of these longer-lived agents in patients. And we can also image. And I want to really focus on this. And imaging allows you to look inside the black box. For 75 years, we've been treating patients like this. Whoops, hold on, let me see if I can find it. Okay, so I'm sorry. So before I get to that, some more stats about radiopharmaceutical therapy. So if we look at number of publications for different cancers by year, we see very early on thyroid in blue has been there and has progressed and is still there. Hematologic malignancy started out probably because of the leukemia studies at Sloan Kettering, initially with I-131 and then with alpha emitters, and these have continued. Over time, we see hepatic has grown because of the Therasphere and microsphere treatments. Breast has kind of always been there. Prostate has grown quite a bit over the years, and certainly more prominent more recently with the prominence of PSMA and other targeting agents. And then this is showing the different radionuclides, not a comprehensive list, but the prominent ones. So you can see I-131 dominates, mostly because of thyroid cancer. And again, keeping in mind, this is just number of publications. Yttrium-90 grew because of the microsphere area, and lutetium-177 didn't really exist until, I guess, somewhere here, and it's clearly blossomed with, again, with the PSMA in the VISION trial, and also some of the some of the peptide work. A samarium, a bone targeting agent, has kind of hung in there. It's been around for a while. And then we have the alphas. So this is interesting actually, because there really weren't, there were no publications related to alphas, even though alphas go back, if not, I suppose a century actually, with some of the, the Curie's work. So initially we had astatine, and then over time, this is probably bismuth-212. So I've grouped the lead and the bismuth-212 together. And then as you can see, actinium popping up here and then growing pretty dramatically. Perhaps the most dramatic alpha-emitting radionuclide that came out of left field is radium-223. And with its FDA approval, we see lots and lots of publications and work looking at combining radium-223 Xofigo with other types of treatments. Thorium started somewhere here and it's still around. I would say thorium is as you'll see later on, is being picked up and could become a very powerful alpha emitter for therapy. So to prove the hypothesis, we have a chicken versus egg conundrum. So going back to the hypothesis, we want to show that test whether imaging therapeutic agents will improve drug efficacy in cancer patient outcomes. Imaging is needed to test the hypothesis, but won't be adopted unless it's been shown to be clinically beneficial. Same problem with dosimetry. So how do we break out of this conundrum? We use a heuristic analogy type argument based on the black box analogy. And by their nature, heuristic algorithms are oversimplifications. They're not rigorous. They rely on examples. So here's what the black box analogy looks like. So we're very good at the input, at understanding mechanisms, more or less. Target validation, again, more or less based on what I showed before. A lot of good work done on preclinical toxicity. This is for agents other than radiopharmaceutical therapeutics. It also applies to radiopharmaceutical therapeutics. So basically, we do a very rigorous evaluation of making sure the agents are good. They've been validated to the extent possible. We do some patient selection based on genomics and more recently Theranostics. Then when we treat, for the most part, and it's changing mostly because we're seeing agents that we can image, where imaging is built into the process. Treatment is a black box. So we put the stuff in, we hope for the best, and then we wait a certain amount of time and look for the response. So tumor response, time to progression, overall survival, quality of life, and clinical toxicity. So these two are based on imaging. And if you have a black box scenario, you can understand what's happening by changing the input and looking at what the response has been. And that's what we've been doing for a long time with agents that we can't image. So let's go back in time to the early 60s and think about the first radiopharmaceutical therapeutic, radioiodine therapy of thyroid cancer. It's the first example of a radiopharmaceutical and potentially the most successful therapy for metastatic cancer. Very early on, before the idea of multiple cycles to evaluate potential toxicity and have each patient be their own control, so you can adjust how much you give in subsequent cycles. Kind of before the chemotherapy paradigm, Benoit and co-workers recognized that prolonging therapy with radioiodine leads to loss of therapeutic efficacy. And Doug today really expanded on this quite a bit and showed a lot of really good examples. I'm going to show one as well. It's hard to wrap up with all the amazing work done. It's hard to wrap up without repeating some of what's been shown before. So they used imaging and dosimetry to deliver the largest safe administered activity with the idea of keeping the blood absorbed dose below 200 gray. Below 2 gray, 200 rads, right? So below 2 gray, and patients with diffuse lung mets, keeping the administered activity below 80 millicuries at 48 hours. So kind of a scheme that's clinically applicable that keeps keeps the physicians out of trouble in terms of patient toxicity. So here's what a patient looks like to a thyroid endocrinologist. So you have the stomach, people eat iodide, and the iodine goes through the stomach, gets absorbed into the circulation. The red oval here is the blood circulation. This big thing here is a thyroid cell. It turns out that, and again, Doug talked about this quite a bit. Turns out if you have, so thyroid cells, one of the key things they do is they concentrate iodine through the sodium symporter pump, and concentrate it at tremendously high concentrations to then make it available for use to make hormone that's important for a whole host of homeostatic functions. So if you replace the iodine with radioactive iodine, you suddenly have tremendously high concentration of radioactivity in these colloid regions within thyroid cancer cells. So when a thyroid cancer cell loses its ability to know that it was a thyroid cancer cell and no longer has the sodium iodide pump, you end up with an image like this. And this is an image that Doug showed, undifferentiated thyroid cancer, meaning these cells no longer have the symporter. This is an I-124 PET image. And this is what happens when you add an inhibitor that restores the sodium iodide symporter. It's a great, I showed this, so I'm going through a series of examples showing how imaging can impact the likelihood of success of a therapeutic. So here's an example where, if you didn't have this image, and again, we saw a whole host of these images from Dr. Van Nostrand, just showing the remarkable change in the distribution by a MEK inhibitor. And now these patients can go on and be successfully treated with iodine 131. So that's an early example. Here's another example, bismuth 213 labeled, alpha-emitter labeled CD33 antibody for patients with myelogenous leukemia. So this was, and John touched on it yesterday, this was a trial done at Sloan Kettering in leukemia patients. Bismuth 213 has a 45.6-minute half-life. To put enough activity into a patient, you have to do 3 to 6 injections over a couple of days, and that's what we did. To image, as John mentioned yesterday, we brought in an engineer to change the high voltage so we could image the 440 kV photons coming out of bismuth 213. We were really concerned about localization to the kidneys. Now everybody knows that bismuth 213 is a concern in terms of potential renal toxicity, but this was really the first treatment of patients with an alpha emitter. Treatment, I guess, was in the late 90s. This was published in 2001. So we imaged the first and last injection, again, concern over renal uptake. So it was a dynamic acquisition because of the short half-life. And John showed one of the images. They weren't great. We had a high energy collimator, highly energetic photon, all kinds of scatter within the collimator, high resolution collimators, reduced the sensitivity. So not great images. We decided to try and get around that by generating rate images to assess kinetics. And this is sort of, starting with lousy images, we tried to make the best of them. And this is kind of the approach we took. Keeping in mind, these are planar studies where the patient's dynamic studies, the patient is presumably not moving over about an hour of imaging, where we collected the dynamic scan. And then we just plot the counts over time, take the slope, fit it to an expression, take the slope, and then present the slope in grayscale. And that's what this is showing. So here are the results. These are 3 different patients, first injection, last injection. And the intensity here is just showing that slope value, the rate at which over time activity or counts in that particular voxel are increasing or decreasing. And 3 different patients, sort of 3 different patterns. You see in this patient, first injection does a reasonably good job of targeting sites in the sacrum and the spinal column. Again, these are leukemia patients. By the last injection, we have really good targeting in sites of leukemia, which would be from the posterior view, the sacrum and the spinal column. Again, second patient, first injection is already targeting quite a bit of the disease. By the time you get to the last injection, you've saturated, so you're no longer really increase. Your rate of targeting is sort of spread out, not just limited to sites of disease. Third patient is kind of similar to the first one, and perhaps the last injection does a good job of increasing the rate at which the agent is going to sites of disease. So all of that visual stuff was useful in that it suggested that the way to move forward in terms of the next trial, and in a sense that's kind of relatively standard practice, is to reduce the tumor burden, try and establish a baseline level for each patient. There are other reasons for doing this. This kind of came into the equation. Seeing this variability across patients was part of the process. So that's another example of how imaging can help improve the likelihood of success of your therapeutic agent. So Xofigo is an FDA-approved agent, alpha particle emitting calcium mimetic, first one to get FDA approval. At the time it was approved, it was the only agent to show increase in castrate-resistant prostate cancer patients with bone metastases. The package insert says 55 kilobecquerel per kilogram for a 70 kilogram male. It's about 105 microcurie per injection. You inject every 4 weeks for a total of 6 injections. This is kind of formulated based on standard practice chemotherapy type reasoning. These are the photons, principal photons, and here are the corresponding half-lives. What's not here is polonium-215, which doesn't emit photons. It has a 1.8 millisecond half-life. So again, some images from the group at Sloan Kettering. This is work John yesterday referred to it from Carrasquillo. Planar images with of radium-223 over time, dynamic initially, and then spot views, taking it out to 6 days. So this was done at 200 kilobecquerel per kilogram. No toxicity was observed. What was observed was very rapid transfer of the agent from the circulation. You don't even see the heart here. So this is IV administered from circulation very rapidly into small intestine and subsequently fecal excretion. By the time all that is gone, by 6 days, you do see a pattern that matches what a bone scan would look like. So you see localization to sites of potentially bony disease, and this is a CT to help orient these images. Another example, and this is the thorium that's in a sense being promoted quite a bit by Bayer Pharmaceuticals. They have a huge platform. They're looking at prostate, mesothelin targets, lymphoma, leukemia, HER2 positive tumors, CD70 positive tumors, fibroblast growth factor receptor positive cancers. The appeal of this is if you've done radium, right, which is what Bayer has done with Xofigo, radium can't be conjugated to anything pretty much because of its radiochemistry. There's an appeal to going to thorium-227 because it can be conjugated. The radiochemistry is essentially a chelation chemistry. And as we've heard, after the first alpha is emitted, the radium is free, and that's what you administer when you administer Xofigo. So there's a good understanding of where the daughter is going and where the subsequent daughters are going. There was a time, actually, I remember in one of the early Toronto meetings, where the idea of administering an alpha emitter that had more than an hour or so half-life was thought to be absolutely crazy, that these things hop all over the place. You can't work with them in the lab. And here we are. 18.7-day half-life, alpha particle emitter being put into humans with a daughter that's got a half-life of 11.4 days. Here are the photon emissions. The administered activity for the CD22 agent, the example I'll show is 6 megabecquerel, 160 microcurie. And here are the images. Again, planar images, 2 separate windows. So not necessarily quantitative, but qualitatively actually make several really important points. And again, by way of highlighting the value of imaging in improving your chances of success if you have a new agent. So if you look at the thorium window, you're seeing a pattern at 24 hours. So the thorium is labeled to the anti-CD22 antibody. You're seeing a pattern that, let me see if I can get rid of this. I don't know if everybody sees it, but anyway. So you're seeing a pattern very similar to what an antibody would do by 24 hours. See it in the heart and in the liver, mostly in the systemic, in the circulation. If you look at the radium-223, again, a familiar pattern that we saw from the previous slide. By 24 hours, it's on its way to being excreted through the feces. It's in the descending colon. If you go out to 28 days, and this is making the point that antibodies stay in the body for a long time. So 28 days, we still see it in the liver. But we also see potential sites of foci. And these may be lesions in the spinal column, or they may be lymph nodes. I'm not familiar with the anatomy enough to be able to judge that. We also see radium-223. So why by 28 days, why do we see radium-223? Well, that's because we have thorium, and the thorium is generating the radium. And the pattern stays the same, sort of on its way to being excreted pretty rapidly through the gut. What this says is that the strategy of using surrogate imaging for thorium-labeled antibody is going to work reasonably well, because thorium-labeled antibodies behave the way indium or zirconium-labeled antibodies behave. So you can do a good job of extracting, using a surrogate to extract the pharmacokinetics of your antibody. And if your first daughter is radium-223, you already know what that's doing, and there's dosimetry that's been worked out for that, more or less. So that points to the idea that you have again, you understand more about how your treatment works. You have a way of doing dosimetry, and you really have a lot more insight into what's going on than the black box approach. So no talk on this topic would be complete without the picture that launched at least a dozen companies focused on actinium PSMA. So this, we've all seen this. I won't say too much about it, but really remarkable demonstration, visual demonstration of the effect of a therapeutic agent. More recently, I'd like to add to this, this is work out of Alphamedics, a group in Texas, with an agent that is a somatostatin receptor targeting agent. They labeled it with lead-212, which decays to bismuth-212, which is an alpha emitter, and found kind of a similar pattern. So this is not a one-off. You can accomplish something similar with other agents. These are anecdotal images, and oncologists will say, well, that's nice, but we really want to see long-term median survival. So this, if nothing else, it really highlights the potential efficacy of alpha particle radiopharmaceutical therapeutics. I'd like now to talk about dosimetry itself. I've talked about imaging and the role that can play on improving the success rate of cancer drugs. So for dosimetry, I'm going to switch to something where the dosimetry is really quite straightforward. And this is a hepatic artery infusion of microspheres for hepatocellular carcinoma and liver cancer. So 5 rigorous trials, they all failed. None met their primary endpoint. This is a slide from Remco Bastianet in my group. Luckily, the field didn't stop, and Jehanne and co-workers decided to spend some time looking at the impact of personalized dosimetry versus the standard dosimetry that's implemented for this treatment approach. And paper got published in Lancet GI. What's nice about these papers is they summarize the findings really, really nicely. So the key point, the implications of all the available evidence, we'll just jump to the, they challenged the conclusion of previous negative randomized phase 3 studies that this approach, a microsphere approach, in which no personalized dosimetry was used. So they got better results, and here are the results they got. Taking all patients, they improved survival by introducing a standardized, by going from standard dosimetry, which is what the package insert has. It's really based on measuring activity over the whole liver, no regard to how much of it is tumor versus non-tumor. If they account for tumor versus non-tumor, if they just do that same agent, just a little bit more math, implementing a more personalized approach, they more than double the surviving time, a roughly 16-month increase in survival, which is really remarkable. No change in the agent, no change in the composition of the patients. Rigorous trial. If they look at survival for the target tumor dose that they had specified before the trial even started, it's easy to. So this is really important in terms of trial design. A threefold improvement in survival. If a result like this were presented at ASCO for a new drug, people would be standing on their chairs applauding. It would be on the front page of the New York Times. This is not an easy cancer, hepatocellular carcinoma, getting this big of an improvement in survival without changing the drug, without changing the patient population, just introducing dosimetry and saying, let's treat all patients in a way where we're going to deliver 205 gray to the tumor. And this is overall survival. It's not, progression delay and other sort of intermediate endpoints. This is the kind of thing that medical oncologists would salivate over if they had drugs that could do this. So with that, I don't have a concluding slide, but I think the overall workshop has done a great job of highlighting a whole host of things. I'd like to acknowledge people in my group, Radiopharmaceutical Therapy and Dosimetry Lab. I think it was Dan mentioned the idea that we need to train more medical physicists to be on both sides, on both the imaging and the therapy side. So at Hopkins, we're starting a program to do exactly that. It's a master's program to put out medical physicists that also understand radiopharmaceutical therapy. We need people like that. I also want to acknowledge collaborators. Eric Fry presented, Young is doing a lot of work on quantitative reconstruction, working with Paul Ladenson on thyroid cancer, Marty Pomper on the PSMA, and so on. And I want to acknowledge support from the NIH that helps pay the bills. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for a most excellent overview of many important aspects when it comes to therapy in general, and in particular to electron and importantly, alpha-emitting therapy. I think you've encapsulated the reason for having this workshop. Thank you for reviewing the contribution of the speakers. And thank you for also setting a direction that hopefully for us is a smart way to proceed going forward. If I could ask the speakers or panel members if there are any remarks, questions that they would like to direct towards Dr. Sgouros. I think we can entertain a little bit of discussion, but we're drawing pretty close to the adjournment time. So I see
George,
John Hum. Yeah. Oh, Jacek, did you have anything that you wanted to?
Yeah, if the people gather thoughts, I have thought of question, or perhaps just, for George, for you, can you list your, I don't know, favorite or perhaps the worst 5, 3, 2, or 5 reasons that are obstacles for implementing dosimetry for RPT?
You know, I would have to say it goes back to chicken and egg. We have one fantastic example where dosimetry has a huge impact. We need more of those kinds of examples. And, you know, I interact with the physicians that have these patients. They're all medical oncologists. That radiation and radionuclide therapy is totally unfamiliar to. In fact, it doesn't even make it onto the NCI website as one of the agents that is potentially promising. So completely unfamiliar. They're really concerned about disrupting their patient schedule. It's a combination. I think until we show that dosimetry changes patient management, we're going to be swimming against the tide. We need studies where we show, like the one by Garant, rigorous multi-arm studies. Now, whether that gets funded or not and what patients will enter into it is a whole lot. So it's not straightforward. But before all that, we need consistent, solid, well-validated, standardized dosimetry methodologies. And if we don't have that and we go into these trials, I think we'll end up proving that nothing works. So we need to have the tools and the methods that are standardized, where a calculation in the US is the same as a calculation in Germany or in France or anywhere in the world. With techniques that are validated. I think the comparison scheme that the SNMMI is putting out with Yuni and Eric and so on is wonderful. We need more of those efforts. You know, it's a combination of finances and clinical practice, I would say, are the major obstacles.
I see John is on video and Vic has his hand up. So John, if you could go first, then we'll get a comment from Vic, looks like.
George, that was an absolutely wonderful talk. And I particularly liked the way that you put all the hurdles and problems of radionuclide therapies next to development of targeted drugs, which have also, you know, had, as you showed, a checkered history in terms of cost and translating into effectiveness. I think we as a community here at this workshop have to think of ways of getting reimbursement. And I don't know what efforts the SNMMI and other organizations like the APM are putting to try to get reimbursement, but you actually said, and Joe O'Donoghue was in my group, says that what we have to do to get reimbursement is we have to show that dosimetry matters. And you gave a fantastic example, which I didn't know about there. But if we can show that dosimetry translates into response, or maybe even more importantly, dosimetry spares patients from marrow, salivary gland, or kidney toxicities, then I think we will get reimbursement. So I think this is the challenge. And I wanted to just add one other point, and that is that in radiation oncology, they do lots of imaging during the treatment, cone beam to verify setup, to check change, you know, to modify the treatment. And I guess in some of those areas, they've had the challenge of getting reimbursement. So I wonder if there's some lessons there that can be learned. The disadvantage we have is we often have to bring the patient back and then consume a gamma camera. In radiation oncology, the patients are coming back for fractionated treatment, so they're already there. So when you tack on an imaging procedure, they're often in the area, you know, they're often on the scanner, and some of those imaging devices are attached to the scanners. So that's an additional slight hurdle that we have. But I think that your presentation was just absolutely wonderful, I have to say. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much, John. Appreciate it.
Vic, thank you, John, very much. Vic, I see that your hand is up. You can turn on your video if you like, or just give us your comment or question.
Yeah. So George, you know, towards the end, you showed a couple of slides and you pointed out this is the kind of data that medical oncologists salivate over. So my question is, why was this published in a journal that no medical oncologist ever reads?
Well,
that's
so it was published in Lancet GI, which is one of the premier medical oncology journals, or it's, I guess, not just oncology, but medicine in general. So it's a high-profile journal. I mean, I guess you're thinking of maybe something like Journal of Clinical Oncology. They went for something better than that because the results are just so profound. It didn't make it into New England Journal of Medicine, but Lancet is actually pretty good also. So I think the visibility is quite high for those results. And Lancet is a pretty high profile, very high profile journal.
Well, there's a difference between Lancet and Lancet GI anyway, but okay. I get your point.
Yuni, I see your hand up. Could you please contribute to this discussion? Oh, you're muted. Unmute first.
Thank you, George, for that very nice overview. I just wanted to add to, I think John Hum mentioned that, in radiation oncology, the patients are already coming for a procedure, so that's why you can tag on the imaging. So I find that this asking the physicians to get patients to come back multiple time points is one of the biggest, for imaging, is one of the biggest hurdles. Our physicians often say, can't you just do the single time point method? I can ask the patients to come back one time, but 4 time points is just way too hard. So I just would like to put a plug in there for the single time point methods that are getting more and more attention recently. I do agree that they have to be thoroughly validated, but I think for some therapies like lutetium PSMA, peptide receptor therapies, it has been validated. And our studies at Michigan are also showing extremely good results with single time point for tumor and organs. So that, I think, is going to be a big step forward if we can do that for many more of the other therapies. Because this is the reaction I get from the physician when I say, I would love to do dosimetry, but we need 4 time points. So.
Right, so it's along the lines of the chicken and egg problem, right? To get to a single time point, you need to have the data set that says, okay, doing it this way will give me an absorbed dose value plus or minus this level of uncertainty. If you want to go from 5 time points to 4, then you sacrifice precision and accuracy. If you want to reduce that even further, we need to have a balance. I think making it simpler is absolutely essential to making it work. But key to doing that is being very upfront about the accuracy that we're losing and the trade-off between reducing number of time points and what the standard deviation on our final number is. And keeping in mind, each organ and each tumor has its own PK. So it's a challenge, but I agree. I think it's absolutely essential to make it easier, reduce the number of time points. But as important is to make it clear to the physicians that, look, okay, you want 2 time points or maybe only 3 or whatever. This is what will happen if we only go with a couple of time points. And it's agent dependent. So for example, for radium-223, you could probably get away with 1 time point because you know how it behaves. It clears quickly, and potentially you need maybe 1 late time point. So I think the principle is there, but in every case, it's critical that we incorporate a measure of accuracy, of how the accuracy suffers from that.
Thank you. We have 2 questions that came in for George, but Wes raised his hand first. So Wes, please chime in.
So George, maybe this is a naive statement, but I'm going to make it anyway. So the argument was, well, if you're doing multiple external beam radiotherapy fractions and you have the imaging system, it's not an issue. Well, what if you're delivering your radiopharmaceutical through multiple injections of administered activity, and you're going to adjust the subsequent administered levels based on dosimetry? Then the imaging is part of the therapy, isn't it not? I mean, why make this false argument that the additional imaging is not part of the therapy? It is part of the therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the response will be, okay, great. They'll come in for cycle 2. Let's collect an image, and it'll be 1 image, and so they come. Yeah, so even that is met. I'm sort of shocked at the idea that for 75 years we've been treating patients with a whole host of things, and no clue as to where they're going or what's happening inside the body. It's the black box thing. And the effect of that is that we have to change the input to figure out what's going on inside the black box. But Wes, you're right. If there were a way to make the community comfortable with the idea that radiopharmaceutical therapy incorporates imaging as part of how you treat the patient, that would be, however we can figure out how to do that, that would be really...
we're talking about arguments to the physicians. We need the patients to advocate for themselves. If you can make the case that they will be treated better with the additional imaging, what patient wouldn't go for that? I mean, and the other way to think about it is, can you imagine a situation where you're treating external beam radiotherapy for a brain tumor, and you're treating every patient with an equivalent entrance photon fluence, right? No adjustments for tumor size, no adjustments for where the tumor is, and you're just going to hit every patient with a constant entrance fluence. I mean, no one does that. So I think just we need to be a little bit more bold, educate the patient communities, and have them self-advocate. So maybe, again, I'm being naive,
but you know, I think I'm glad you brought up the point about external beam radiotherapy. In a sense, radiopharmaceutical therapy is suffering because we're too safe. I mean, the reason patients go through all this stuff in external beam radiotherapy is because you can really do serious damage if you don't do it right. You know, with radionuclides, we've been cautious. We've been underdosing potentially.
Yes.
The toxicity is not as clear cut. Patients have a lot of prior therapy. So by having done it so sort of cautiously, we've reduced the, and also whether dosimetry works is also a question. I think the early days of dosimetry were not ideal. We weren't doing it right, and even though there was an effort to try and come up with dose-response relationships.
But we need the multiple time point imagings to do the dosimetry correct to show that it works.
Yes.
So it's exactly your.
You know, agreed, but I think Yuni's point is also important. I mean, if we can collect the data to arrive at easier ways of doing it that also are accompanied by a measure of potential accuracy of the agent, then I would go with that. And then, you know, it doesn't, I mean, it has to be better than what we're doing right now. It doesn't have to be perfect. So as long as we can get to something that achieves, I mean, again, the same drug, 3 times better survival, just remarkable. I can't emphasize how radium-223 Xofigo was FDA approved with a 2-month improvement in survival.
Yeah, and now you've got something like that.
And you know, it's not like the disease is easy to treat. I mean, hepatocellular carcinoma is really incurable. But giving patients another, whatever it was, 3 years of life, near the end of their life, is a remarkable accomplishment.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, these are all good arguments that we certainly want to write up in our summary and use for future arguments when we speak to agencies for reimbursement. We have some raised hands, but some questions came in, typed in. One question from Joe O'Donoghue at Sloan Kettering. The 227 thorium versus 223 radium images you showed looked surprisingly different. He would have anticipated that if there was binding, a lot of radium-223 would have remained in the same location as the thorium-227. The differential radium distribution suggests that most thorium decays occurred in the circulation. Did you find this surprising?
You know, as always, Joe's questions are great. You know, I didn't look at it from that perspective. I guess I went into it biased, the way the development has gone in. Right, you would think that a thorium decaying in a tumor, depending on the charge of radium, maybe the radium would stay in the environment, but it's a free atom, so it's not completely surprising that it ends up in circulation pretty quickly, and then it just follows the kinetics of radium-223. So how much of that is decays in circulation versus decays in tumors? As Joe said, most of the activity in the thorium column were decays in circulation. So that if the thorium had all gone to a big tumor, then yes, I'd be wondering why isn't more of the radium? Maybe it's a charged thing sticking in the vicinity because you have cationic interactions with the cell membrane being more positively charged and so on. I don't know what the charge of radium is, but you'd expect some kind of more localized, so less of a pattern similar to the radium-223, but absolutely where the daughters go depends on where the parent, the radiolabeled parent decays. For actinium, I think of it if the actinium decay happens in circulation, then you'd expect, I don't know, maybe 70% of the bismuth to decay in the kidneys. If it happens in the tumor, maybe 70% in the tumor and 15 or 20% in the kidneys. It's a combination of where the decay happens, and if you get the agent to clear quickly, it sticks like the PRIT scheme, then you remove the source of bismuth-213 and you don't worry about the kidneys at all. Kidney toxicity from bismuth-213, by the way, in humans hasn't been demonstrated. So it's something to think about, but across the board with the actinium stuff, the small molecule stuff, it's been something everybody worries about, but there's been no clinical example yet. And maybe it's too early to tell because renal toxicity takes a while, although these things have been going on for multiple years now. So it's never been an issue. Okay.
So we have our panelist, Robert Mioka has a question or a comment.
So
Robert?
I guess I have a comment. I appreciate the comments about wanting to do kind of personalized dosimetry and doing the studies to really kind of take measurements for doing that. And I just want to say that one of the things that we're working on is that, you know, if we get the uptake information from an image, we've shown that you could use a small number of sensors that actually can be used to monitor the washout kinetics. And we think that we could do that remotely with patients so that they don't have to come back to imaging centers for all the imaging requirements. So, you know, I think that in the long term, you know, we'd like to see the you know, measurements being used for actually doing the personalized dosimetry. And I think it's going to be feasible, especially because there's different things you need to do. So you have the one image, you could do the washout kinetics using much simpler technology. So.
Yeah, you know, absolutely. So the long-term solution for this is to just have the patient go home wearing a camera. So in you know, in treatment of thyroid, there's this thyroid collar where patients do go home and they get monitored over time. You know, technology is going to make a huge difference. I mean, we saw that from yesterday's session. What's interesting about this whole workshop is the society, we've had a series of papers where I was looking at the back and forth, and one of the comments was, let's just decide that alpha emitter dosimetry is just not possible because we can't image, we can't do this, we can't do that. I mean, what NIBID does is it takes away the impossibility of doing things. I mean, we developed technology that just makes it happen. And that's really an amazing thing.
Yep, thank you. It looks like we're drawing to a close. We have one last question, an international question from Germany, Julia Brosch-Lenz. She thanks you very much for a wonderful lecture. She agrees. Oh, it just disappeared. I'll have to see what happened to that question. But there is.
I'm sorry, George, I typed an answer and it moved it to the answered question. So if you open the second tab, you'll find the question. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I didn't think when I answered it would move it. Sorry about that.
Oh, yeah. Let's see. Okay, so I found it. I guess, well, we can go to your. Well, let's pose it to George and see what he says. Although you have an answer to it also. Let's see. I fully agree that the results from the personalized re-embolization are stunning, but for RPT personalization, how can we achieve that? Starting with a fixed activity for the first cycle and then adapt based on dosimetry, ? How to handle the tumor sink effect then, which would rather want us to get as much activity in the patient during the first cycle. How could we plan the first cycle personalized?
Yeah, I mean, again, another very perceptive question. I think that's exactly on target. The point is that with radiation, you don't want to protract. You want to make sure that your first administration is optimized. And if you take an approach of saying, okay, we'll do fixed for the initial one and then adjust for subsequent, for the next cycle, you're not completely there. I guess I would say it's better than each cycle having the same amount. And I know Yuni has done some work and others have done work showing how the dose required on subsequent cycles is not necessarily always the same. In some patients, you don't need as much, in some you need a lot more. You know, the issue of saturation, the issue of the first one not delivering the maximum amount you'd like to deliver is absolutely of concern. It goes back to whether we have the, I would say for antibodies, for the most part, depending on the receptor number and so on, we're probably not saturating the tumor sites after the first injection. That then does allow for the second injection to target more of the tumor. But yeah, it's a problem, and I other than it's better than what we're doing, I don't really have a good answer for it.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm sure discussions and questions could go on and on and on. We are very close to our time to adjourn. And thank you, George, very much for putting it all together and giving us a grand overview. I would just like to wrap up with a couple of comments. If we could put the challenge slide up as a backdrop. That's the one. So George, thanks for your recent plug about NIBIB making all things possible. We will try to live up to that statement. But in the beginning, yesterday, Dr. Kandarpa put up this slide when he welcomed everybody to the meeting. And challenged us to see whether we could, on the right-hand side, right-hand panel, improve the current imaging of alpha-emitting radiopharmaceuticals into the future. And we've been asking ourselves whether it would be possible or how to do that compared to some of the improvements that NIBIB through the years has supported, demonstrated with a typical PET scan acquired in the year 2008. And oh, how these images have improved to our current state of the art. So yeah, I believe that since 2000, NIBIB has made a name for itself in developing such tools, technologies, and improvements that offer clinically oriented institutes like NCI and others to use for their support of studying specific diseases and specific organs. That, in fact, is explicitly our mission. I believe that this workshop has taken the first step in evaluating the physician's need for treating cancer, together with the imaging scientist's knowledge of instrumentation and dosimetry calculations, to plot a new course to work together for finding a way to improve cancer treatment outcomes with alpha-emitting radioisotopes. The goal is to improve cancer patient outcomes and survivals. So I would like to thank the speakers, the panelists for their contributions. I'd like to thank the 100+ attendees who came to this workshop for their interest in discussions and typed in questions that have made this workshop the success that it is. Thanks to Sarah and Heather from Infinity Conferences. They were the ones that organized the schedules. They kept us on track. They kept us transmitting and on the air. So thank you very much for your essential support. Society of Nuclear Medicine supported us from the beginning when we planned to have this as an in-person meeting. And I thank Jacek for co-moderating and the Cancer Institute for co-sponsoring. So I can only conclude by saying that we look forward to continuing this workshop next year, hopefully for additional discussions and to hopefully review some progress that's made based on some of the insights that we've presented and brought to light here. If you missed any part of this workshop, it will be archived in the NIH archive. It'll take us several days or a couple of weeks to get it finalized and put on the archive. But if you registered for this workshop, we will keep in touch with you. We will send you information as to where the recorded workshop can be found. I want to thank everyone and wish that you stay safe and well in this continuing return to some normalcy after the COVID disruption in our lives. We will keep in touch and look forward to seeing everybody next year in the continuing saga of this workshop. So thank you very much. And we are adjourning 3 minutes late. So I consider even that to be very successful and well planned. So thank everybody, and we'll see you.
Thank you, George, for organizing it. And this is, I hope, the first of many similar meetings. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jacek. We'll see everybody next year. We'll keep in touch.
Thank you, George.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, George.